Sometimes the measure of a man isn't found in his words, but in the moment he chooses to stand when everyone else walks away. In the unforgiving town of Dustwater Gulch, where mercy was scarce and justice came at the end of a gun, Clara Whitfield learned this truth through blood and tears. She was 27 when she gave birth to twin girls whose mixed heritage painted targets on their backs. Her husband's family made their feelings clear with fists and fury, leaving her beaten and broken in the dirt streets. That's when Colt Braddock, a giant of a cowboy with hands like hammers and a heart bigger than Texas, heard her cries. He found her there, clutching her babies, face swollen from another beating. Without hesitation, Colt drew his Colt, 45, and stepped between Clara and the gathering mob. "You'll have to kill me first," he growled, his voice cutting through the desert wind like a blade. What happened next would change both their lives forever. But what happens when the past comes calling with a vengeance nobody saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dustwater Gulch wasn't much to look at, even on its best days. The town squatted like a sun-bleached scab on the Texas plains, where the wind carried more dust than hope, and the nearest law worth trusting was a 3-day ride to Austin. Founded in 1847 by cattle barons who saw dollar signs in the endless grasslands, it had grown into something that resembled civilization if you squinted hard and ignored the rough edges. The main street stretched maybe 200 yards from the saloon on one end to the church on the other, as if God and the devil had agreed to keep a respectful distance. Between them sat the general store, the blacksmith shop, Doc Henderson's medical practice, and Sheriff Morrison's office, a man who wore his badge like a costume and treated justice like a commodity to be bought and sold. Clara Whitfield had called this place home for 3 years now, ever since she'd married Thomas Whitfield in a ceremony that felt more like a business transaction than a celebration of love. She'd been 24 then, a school teacher from San Antonio whose family had fallen on hard times. Thomas, 10 years her senior, owned the largest cattle operation within 50 miles of Dustwater Gulch. He was decent enough. She supposed never raised his hand to her, provided a comfortable house, and treated her with the kind of distant respect one might show a prized heifer. But love? That had come later, and from a direction nobody expected. Samuel Washington had arrived at the Whitfield Ranch in the spring of 1868, carrying papers that proved his freedom and a letter of recommendation from a ranch owner in Kansas. He was tall and lean, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work and eyes that held depths. Clara found herself wanting to explore. Thomas hired him on the spot. Good ranch hands were scarce, and Samuel knew cattle, like some men knew scripture. Clara first noticed Samuel during the summer roundup. While the other hands whooped and hollered like boys at play, he worked with a quiet intensity that drew her attention. He had a way with the animals that bordered on mystical, calming, spooked steers, with nothing more than his voice and presence. Thomas often said Samuel was worth 3 ordinary cowboys, and he paid him accordingly, a fact that didn't sit well with some of the other hands. The first real conversation between Clara and Samuel happened by accident. She'd been hanging laundry behind the main house when a sudden storm rolled in, bringing with it the kind of rain that could turn dry creek beds into rushing torrents within minutes. Samuel appeared as if from nowhere, helping her gather the clothes before they were soaked through. "Thank you," she'd said, water dripping from the brim of her bonnet. "My pleasure, ma'am," he'd replied, his voice carrying the educated cadence that made some of the White Ranch hands uncomfortable. "Storms like this, they don't give much warning out here." That should have been the end of it, a simple exchange between employer's wife and hired hand. But Clara found herself looking for reasons to be outside when Samuel was working near the house. She'd bring him water during the hottest part of the day, or seek his advice about the vegetable garden she was trying to establish. Slowly, carefully, they began to talk about more than weather and work. Samuel had been born into slavery on a plantation outside New Orleans. When emancipation came, he'd headed west like thousands of others, seeking land and opportunity in territories where a man's worth might be measured by his work rather than the color of his skin. He could read and write skills taught to him in secret by the plantation owner's daughter, and he carried with him a battered guitar that had belonged to his father. "Music," he told Clara one evening as she sat on the porch, and he tuned the instrument in the fading light. "It's the one thing they could never take away from us. No matter how hard the day, no matter how heavy the burden, you could always find a song to carry you through." Clara had never heard music like that, not the formal hymns from church or the rowdy saloon songs that drifted through town on Saturday nights, but something deeper. Samuel's fingers moved across the strings with the same gentle precision he used to handle spooked cattle, coaxing melodies that spoke of sorrow and hope in equal measure. Thomas was away more often than not, trailing cattle to market or conducting business in Austin. During those long absences, Clara and Samuel's conversations grew longer, more intimate. They talked about books he'd read, more than most men in town, white or black, about dreams of better times, about the weight of living in a world that seemed determined to keep decent people apart. The inevitable happened on a warm night in September. Thomas had been gone for 2 weeks, and Clara sat on the porch, listening to Samuel play his guitar after the day's work was done. The song he chose was a lullaby his mother had sung to him as a child, something about holding on to hope, even in the darkest hours. When he finished, Clara found herself crying not from sadness, but from a sudden understanding of how empty her life had been before this music, before these conversations, before the gentle way Samuel looked at her as if she was something precious rather than merely useful. "I should go," he said, reading the danger in the moment. "Should you?" she asked. That night changed everything. Their love affair was conducted in stolen moments and whispered conversations, in glances across the ranch yard that lasted a heartbeat too long. They both understood the risks not just to their jobs or reputations, but to their lives. Texas in 1869 was not kind to white women who loved black men, or to black men who loved white women. Thomas returned from his cattle drive in late October, bronzed by the sun and full of plans for expanding the ranch. He seemed genuinely pleased to see Clara, bringing her fabric for a new dress and stories from the trail. If he noticed anything different about his wife, he never mentioned it. Thomas Whitfield was a good man in his way, but he saw what he expected to see, and he expected loyalty. The pregnancy became apparent by Christmas. Clara told Thomas the child was his, conceived during his brief return from the October cattle drive. He accepted this news with the practical satisfaction of a man who'd always wanted sons to help run his growing empire. He began making plans, adding rooms to the house, talking about hiring a woman from town to help Clara with the baby, discussing which of his brothers might be suitable godfathers. Samuel said nothing, but Clara caught him sometimes staring at her growing belly with an expression that mixed joy and terror in equal measure. They both knew the child might favor its father in ways that would be impossible to explain or hide. Thomas never lived to meet his supposed child. In March, while driving a herd to market, his horse threw him during a river crossing. By the time the other cowboys pulled him from the muddy water, Thomas Whitfield was dead at 37, leaving behind a pregnant wife and a ranch that his brothers immediately began circling like buzzards. Jake Whitfield, Thomas's younger brother, arrived for the funeral with his wife and 2 sons, along with an assumption that he would now run the family operation. He was everything Thomas hadn't been: loud, crude, and possessed of the kind of casual cruelty that seemed to feed on others' weakness. His first act was to fire half the ranch hands, including Samuel, claiming the operation needed to cut costs. "Time for some changes around here," Jake announced at the funeral dinner, his words carrying the weight of a man who decided Clara's mourning period was over before it began. Thomas was too soft, paid colored boys like they were white men. That stops now. Clara bit her tongue and endured, believing she could outlast Jake's initial show of authority. She was, after all, Thomas's widow, and surely that counted for something. The pregnancy continued, and Clara found herself hoping for daughters rather than sons. Girls might escape the scrutiny that would come with inheriting the Whitfield name and legacy. Samuel had taken work at a smaller ranch 20 miles south, but he found ways to check on Clara. Sometimes he'd arrive after dark, slipping through shadows to spend an hour in the barn, just talking. Clara would bring him news of the baby's development, and he would share what little money he'd managed to save his dream of buying land somewhere they could be together, somewhere their child could grow up free. The twins came on a hot August night, with only Doc Henderson in attendance. Jake had forbidden any of the ranch wives from helping, claiming Clara needed to learn self-reliance. Doc Henderson, a man in his 60s who delivered half the babies in the county, took one look at the newborns and understood immediately why Jake Whitfield was going to become a very dangerous man. Rose and Lily were beautiful children, healthy, alert, and unmistakably their father's daughters. Their skin held the warm tones of Samuel's heritage, their hair showed his texture, and their eyes reflected his intelligence. There would be no hiding their parentage, no pretending these children belonged to Thomas Whitfield. Doc Henderson wrapped the babies in the cleanest cloth he could find and placed them in Clara's arms. "They're perfect," he said, his voice gentle but his eyes worried. "Clara, you need to understand what this means." She understood. Jake Whitfield would see these children as proof of his sister-in-law's betrayal, evidence that could be used to strip her of any claim to the ranch or even her place in the community. Worse, he might see them as threats to be eliminated. "You need to get word to their father," Doc Henderson said. "Tonight," but it was too late. Jake had been waiting outside the house, listening. When Doc Henderson emerged, Jake was there with two of his sons and the new ranch foreman, a hard man named Briggs, who wore his gun like he knew how to use it. "Interesting night for deliveries," Jake said, his voice carrying the mock friendliness that preceded his worst moments. "Thomas's children, are they?" Doc Henderson met his gaze steadily. "I delivered 2 healthy girls to Clara Whitfield. That's all that matters to me." "Oh, I think it matters quite a bit more than that, Doc. See, those children don't look much like my brother. They look like that guitar-picking field hand Thomas was fool enough to trust." Inside the house, Clara heard every word. She clutched her daughters closer, her blood-stained shawl, the only clean fabric she'd had available, wrapped around them both. The shawl had been a wedding gift from her mother, cream-colored silk that had now absorbed the proof of her children's birth and her own pain. Jake entered the house without knocking, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Clara was still weak from labor, but she managed to sit up in bed, positioning herself between Jake and the babies. "Well, well," Jake said, looking down at the newborns. "Thomas always said you were a fine-looking woman, Clara. Didn't mention you were a whore." "Get out," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse but determined. "This is my house now," Jake replied. "Has been since Thomas died. And these," he gestured at the babies, "these are proof that you've been spreading your legs for the help. Makes me wonder what else you've been giving away that belonged to my brother." Clara said nothing, but her arms tightened around Rose and Lily. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake continued. "Come morning, you're going to tell everyone in town that these children belong to some traveling man who took advantage of your grief. Then you're going to pack your things and leave Dustwater Gulch. Forever." "No." The word came out stronger than Clara had intended. Jake's expression darkened. "That wasn't a request. You've brought shame on the Whitfield name, and I won't have it. Those babies, if they live, they'll grow up knowing they're bastards. Better for everyone if they don't grow up at all." Doc Henderson stepped forward then, his medical bag in one hand and a small pistol in the other. "Jake, you're talking about harming newborn children. I won't allow it." Jake laughed. "You won't allow it? Old man, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Briggs here has been itching for some excitement." That was when they heard the sound of a horse approaching at a hard gallop. Jake's men tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. Through the window, Clara could see a massive figure dismounting from an equally massive horse, Colt Braddock, drawn by the sound of raised voices and the sight of too many horses outside a house where a woman had just given birth. Colt had never been one to mind his own business when it came to folks in trouble. At 34, he stood 6 feet 4 inches in his boots and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd never backed down from anything in his life. His reputation in Dustwater Gulch was built on 2 things: his ability to break the wildest horses and his absolute refusal to tolerate bullies. He'd grown up an orphan after his parents died in a cholera outbreak when he was 12. The other ranch hands had raised him, teaching him everything they knew about cattle, horses, and the kind of honor that didn't depend on what others thought of you. He'd inherited a small patch of land from his mentor, not much, but enough to run a few head of cattle and live independently. In his saddlebags, wrapped in oiled cloth, Colt carried his father's silver star, earned during the war with Mexico. Tarnished now, but still catching the light. He'd never worn it, never felt worthy of the honor it represented, but he carried it as a reminder of what it meant to stand for something larger than yourself. Colt knocked on the doorframe but didn't wait for permission to enter. He took in the scene immediately. Clara weak in bed with newborns in her arms, Doc Henderson holding a gun on Jake Whitfield, and Jake's men ready for violence. "Seems like a lot of commotion for a birthing," Colt observed, his voice calm, but his eyes measuring distances and angles. "This is family business," Jake snapped. "Move along." Colt looked at Clara, really looked at her, seeing not just the exhaustion and fear, but the fierce protectiveness in the way she held those babies. He saw the blood on her shawl, the bruises on her face that were too fresh to be from childbirth, and something in his chest went cold and hard. "Ma'am," he said to Clara, "are you and your children in danger here?" Clara met his eyes. In them, she saw something she'd almost stopped believing in a man who would do what was right simply because it was right, without counting the cost. "Yes," she whispered. Colt nodded once, then turned to Jake. "Then I guess it's my business after all." That was how it began, not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with a simple acknowledgement that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were long and the consequences severe. Colt Braddock had found his calling in that blood-stained room, holding fast to principles his father's silver star had taught him, even though he'd never understood their weight until this moment. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming change, the kind that reshapes the landscape and tests the foundations of everything people thought they knew about right and wrong, about family and loyalty, about the price of standing up when it would be easier to walk away. In her arms, Rose and Lily slept peacefully, unaware that their very existence had just lit the fuse on something that would either transform Dustwater Gulch or burn it to the ground. The confrontation in Clara's bedroom might have escalated to bloodshed that very night, but Jake Whitfield was smarter than his brutish reputation suggested. He recognized the steel in Colt Braddock's eyes and understood that pushing too hard too fast might leave him with bodies to explain and witnesses who'd seen too much. "This isn't over," Jake told Clara as he backed toward the door, his men following. "You think about what I said. Think real hard." After they left, Colt helped Doc Henderson tend to Clara while she nursed the twins. The old doctor's hands shook slightly as he cleaned her wounds, evidence of a beating that had happened before labor began. "Jake did this?" Colt asked, his voice quiet but dangerous. "His sons," Clara whispered. "They wanted to know where Samuel had gone. I wouldn't tell them." Doc Henderson finished bandaging a cut on Clara's forehead. "She needs rest and safety, neither of which she's likely to get here." "My cabin's not much," Colt said, "but it's defensible. And Jake Whitfield doesn't own it." Clara started to protest. She barely knew this man, and she'd already brought enough trouble into the world, but Colt held up a hand. "Ma'am, I've seen what men like Jake do to women and children when nobody's watching. I won't have it, not in my town." That night, under cover of darkness, Colt moved Clara and the twins to his small cabin, 3 miles outside Dustwater Gulch. It wasn't much, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that offered clear sightlines in all directions, but it was clean and safe and, most importantly, it was his. For 3 days, an uneasy quiet settled over the situation. Clara recovered her strength, while Colt went about his usual business of tending his small herd and maintaining his property. He was gentle with the babies, awkward but determined, fashioning makeshift cribs from wooden crates and learning how to warm milk when Clara was too exhausted to nurse. The calm shattered on the 4th morning when Jake arrived at the cabin with Sheriff Morrison and 3 other men. They found Colt splitting wood behind the house, his shirt off in the early heat, sweat gleaming on muscles earned through years of hard work. "Morning, Colt," Sheriff Morrison called out, his tone falsely casual. "Need to have a word with you." Colt set down his axe and reached for his shirt, never taking his eyes off the assembled men. "Sheriff, Jake, what brings you out this way?" "Seems there's been some property stolen from the Whitfield Ranch," Morrison said. "Valuable property that belongs to the family." "That's so?" Colt finished, buttoning his shirt, his movements deliberate and calm. "What kind of property?" Jake stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and heat. "Don't play stupid, Braddock. You know exactly what I'm talking about. My brother's widow and those bastard children she whelped. They belong with family." "Funny," Colt said. "From what I hear, you were fixing to throw them out of that family just a few days ago." Inside the cabin, Clara heard the voices and moved to the window, the twins in her arms. She could see the tension in the way the men stood, hands near their weapons, horses restless in the morning heat. "That's not your concern," Jake snapped. "Clara is a Whitfield, and those children, legitimate or not, are my responsibility. I'm taking them home. And if they don't want to go?" Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. "The law's clear on this, Colt. A widow belongs with her husband's family until she remarries or proves she can support herself. And children belong with their legal guardians." "Legal guardians?" Colt's voice carried an edge now. "Jake, you mind telling me exactly what your legal claim is to children that aren't your brothers?" The silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand what had just been said. Jake's face went dark red, and his hand dropped to his gun. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm asking you a question. Those babies don't look much like Thomas. Don't look like Clara either, come to think of it. So I'm wondering why you're so eager to claim responsibility for them." That was when Jake made his mistake. Instead of backing down or finding a face-saving way out of the confrontation, his pride and anger got the better of him. "Because someone needs to clean up the mess that whore made with her colored lover," he shouted. "Thomas might have been fool enough to let it happen under his own roof, but I won't have bastard pickaninnies carrying the Whitfield name." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable, whatever deal he'd made with Jake. It probably hadn't included public admissions of racial hatred. The other men shifted nervously. Suddenly unsure, they wanted to be part of whatever was about to happen. Colt's expression never changed, but something fundamental shifted in the way he stood. "That's an interesting perspective, Jake. Tell me, what evidence do you have that those children aren't Thomas's? Look at them." Jake gestured wildly toward the cabin. "Any fool can see. I see 2 healthy babies." Colt interrupted. "Born to a woman who lost her husband and needed help. What I don't see is any proof of wrongdoing or any legal right for you to take them from their mother." Sheriff Morrison tried to regain control of the situation. "Now, Colt, we don't want any trouble here. Jake's family, and family has rights. To beat a woman who just gave birth, to threaten newborn children? Sheriff, what exactly are the rights we're talking about here?" Clara chose that moment to step out of the cabin, the twins in her arms, her blood-stained shawl wrapped around them like a banner of defiance. The morning sun caught the silver threads in the fabric, making it shine despite the stains. "I won't go back," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Not to that house, not to that family. These are my children, and I'll raise them where they're safe. Jake took a step toward her, his face twisted with rage. "You don't have a choice, you lying." He never finished the sentence. Colt moved faster than any man his size had a right to, covering the distance between them in 3 quick strides. His left hand grabbed Jake's shirt front, while his right drew his Colt, .45, in one smooth motion, the barrel coming to rest against Jake's temple. "Careful with your words," Colt said conversationally, "lady present and all." For a moment, the only sound was the morning wind moving through the grass, and the soft murmur of one of the twins beginning to fuss. Jake's men had their hands on their guns, but none of them wanted to be the first to draw on a man who already had his weapon ready. "You're making a mistake, Braddock," Jake said through gritted teeth. "I've got the law on my side." "Do you?" Colt looked at Sheriff Morrison. "Sheriff, what law says a man can force a woman to live where she doesn't want to live? What law says he can claim children that aren't his?" Morrison was sweating now, caught between his deal with Jake and the growing certainty that this situation was spiraling beyond his control. "Well, there are laws about family responsibility, and there are laws about assault and battery," Doc Henderson's voice called out from behind them. The old doctor had arrived unnoticed, his medical bag in one hand and a shotgun in the other. "Laws about threatening women and children, laws about false imprisonment." "Doc," Morrison said weakly, "you don't understand the situation here." "Oh, I understand it perfectly." Doc Henderson moved to stand beside Clara, his shotgun pointed in the general direction of Jake's men. "I understand that Jake Whitfield has been spreading lies about these children to cover up his own illegal actions. I understand that he's been threatening a woman who just gave birth, trying to force her to give up her babies." "Illegal actions?" Morrison looked confused. Doc Henderson reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "This is a letter I witnessed Thomas Whitfield write 3 days before he died. It specifically states that all his property should go to his wife Clara, including any children she might bear. It's signed, witnessed, and legally binding." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's face went from red to white as the implications sank in. If Clara legally owned the ranch, then everything he'd done since Thomas's death, firing the hands, claiming authority, making decisions about the property, had been theft. "That's impossible," Jake stammered. "Thomas never wrote any such thing." "Are you calling me a liar?" Doc Henderson's voice was mild, but his shotgun never wavered. "Because I have the original document in my office, along with my medical notes documenting the injuries Clara sustained when your sons beat her for information about Samuel Washington." Colt kept his gun pressed against Jake's head, but looked at Clara. "Ma'am, did you know about this letter?" Clara shook her head, tears starting to flow. "Thomas never said anything to me about a will. He was worried," Doc Henderson explained. "Worried about his brothers, worried about what would happen to you if something happened to him. He made me promise to keep the document safe until it was needed." Sheriff Morrison was looking increasingly desperate. His arrangement with Jake had depended on Clara being powerless, without legal standing or protection. If she actually owned the largest ranch in the county, everything changed. "Even if that's true," Morrison said, "it doesn't change the fact that she's been living in sin, corrupting the Whitfield name." "Sheriff," Colt said quietly, "you're talking about a woman who lost her husband and then gave birth to 2 children. Whatever happened before that, whatever you think you know about it, she's done nothing that warrants the treatment she's received." Jake tried to pull free from Colt's grip. "Those children are an abomination, mixed-breed bastards that shouldn't be allowed to live." The words were barely out of his mouth when Colt's gun hand moved. Instead of shooting, he brought the heavy barrel down across Jake's skull with enough force to drop him to his knees. Blood began to flow from a gash on his forehead. "Now that," Colt said calmly, "was uncalled for." The other men tensed, but Doc Henderson swung his shotgun to cover them. "Anyone else have opinions about these babies they'd like to share?" Clara stepped forward, still holding the twins, her voice stronger now. "My children are not bastards or abominations. They are Rose and Lily, and they're beautiful, and they're mine." If that letter is real, then this ranch is mine too, and I won't have them raised around people who see them as anything less than perfect. She looked directly at Sheriff Morrison. Sheriff, I want to file charges against Jake Whitfield for assault, battery, theft, and making threats against my children. Morrison looked around desperately, realizing that his comfortable arrangement with Jake was crumbling. Now, Clara, there's no need to get the law involved in family disputes. You're right, Colt said. There's no need to get you involved at all. He released Jake, who slumped to the ground, still dazed from the blow. Because starting right now, I'm Clara's protector, and that means anyone who threatens her or those babies answers to me. He looked at each of Jake's men in turn. You boys rode out here with Jake because you thought you were backing the new boss. Turns out the boss is still Clara Whitfield, and she's got herself some new management. I suggest you ride back to town and think real hard about where your loyalties lie. One by one, Jake's men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving only Sheriff Morrison and the still bleeding Jake in Colt's yard. This isn't over, Jake said, struggling to his feet. I'll fight this in court. I'll prove those children are illegitimate. You'll do nothing, Clara interrupted. Because if Doc Henderson is right about that letter, you've been stealing from me for months. Every decision you made, every dollar you spent, every hand you fired, all of it was theft. And now that I know the truth, you're going to return what's mine, or I'll see you in prison. Jake mounted his horse with shaking hands, blood still trickling down his face. You think you've won something here? You think hiding behind this gun-happy giant changes anything? There are others who feel the way I do about race-mixing whores and their mongrel spawn. You'll never be safe in this town. Colt's hand dropped to his gun again, but Clara spoke first. Then we'll make it safe, she said simply. Starting now. As Jake and Sheriff Morrison rode away, Clara turned to Colt and Doc Henderson. I don't know how to thank you both. No thanks needed, Doc Henderson said. Just promise me you'll be careful. Jake's not going to let this go easily. Colt was already thinking ahead, his mind working through the implications of what had just happened. Clara owned one of the largest ranches in Texas, but she also had a target on her back. The twins were safe for now, but Jake had allies in town, men who shared his views about racial purity and a woman's place. Doc, he said, how legal is that letter? Legal enough to stand up in any court in Texas. I witnessed Thomas sign it, and I kept detailed records. Clara's rights are clear. Then we're going to need help, Colt said, because Jake's not going to fight this in court. He's going to fight it the only way men like him know how. Clara looked down at her daughters, sleeping peacefully, despite the violence that had just erupted around them. In their faces she could see Samuel's gentle eyes and strong jaw, mixed with her own stubborn chin and Thomas's practical nature. They were beautiful, perfect, and innocent of the hatred their very existence seemed to inspire. Whatever comes, she said, they'll grow up free. They'll know they're loved, and they'll never bow to men like Jake Whitfield. Colt nodded, understanding that he'd just committed himself to something larger than protecting one woman and her children. He'd committed himself to changing the very nature of Dustwater Gulch, to proving that decency could triumph over hatred, that love could overcome fear. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the coolness and promising another scorching day. But in the shadow of Colt's small cabin, 3 adults and 2 babies began the work of building something new, a family forged not by blood or law, but by choice and courage, and the simple recognition that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. In the days that followed Jake's humiliation, Colt discovered that protecting a woman and 2 infants required skills he'd never needed as a bachelor. His small cabin, which had seemed perfectly adequate for a man who spent most of his time outdoors, suddenly felt cramped and inadequate. Clara was still weak from childbirth and the beating she'd endured, so Colt found himself learning the mysteries of infant care through trial and error. He'd always been good with his hands, could gentle the wildest horse, repair any piece of broken equipment, build whatever needed building, but babies were different. They were fragile in ways that made his calloused fingers feel clumsy and dangerous. The first night, when both twins began crying at once, and Clara was too exhausted to wake fully, Colt stood in his long underwear, holding one baby, while the other wailed from her makeshift crib. Feeling more helpless than he had since childhood, he tried singing rough cowboy songs that seemed to make the crying worse, then speaking in the same low, calm voice he used with spooked horses. That worked better. Rose, the slightly larger of the twins, settled against his broad chest and went back to sleep. Lily took longer to calm, but eventually she too surrendered to exhaustion. Colt spent the rest of that night in his wooden chair, a baby in each arm, discovering that sleep was apparently optional when children were involved. By the end of the first week, he'd fashioned proper cradles from cedar wood, working late into the night by lamplight, while Clara and the babies slept. He carved them with the same patience he brought to breaking horses, smooth curves that would rock gently, high sides to keep the babies safe, and small hearts carved into the headboards, because something told him these children deserved beauty as well as safety. "You didn't have to do this," Clara said, when she woke to find the finished cradles beside the bed, Rose and Lily sleeping peacefully in their new beds. "Every child deserves a proper place to sleep," Colt replied, running his thumb along one of the carved hearts. "Besides, those wooden crates were too small. They're growing fast." Clara studied his profile in the morning light, streaming through the cabin window. There was something remarkable about watching this large, powerful man bend his strength to such gentle purposes. His hands, which could break a man's jaw or draw a gun faster than thought, moved with infinite care when he touched the babies. "Have you ever wanted children of your own?" she asked. Colt was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on adjusting Rose's blanket. "Never really thought about it. Always figured I was meant to be alone. And now?" He looked at her then, his grey eyes holding depths she was only beginning to understand. "Now, I think maybe I was wrong about what I was meant for." Outside, the work of the ranch continued, but differently now. Colt had always run a small operation, a dozen horses, maybe 30 head of cattle, but Clara's legal ownership of the Whitfield spread changed everything. The question was whether they could claim what was rightfully hers without starting a war. Doc Henderson rode out every few days to check on Clara's recovery and the baby's health. During one of these visits, he brought disturbing news from town. "Jake's been busy," he reported, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into the chair Colt had built for the porch. "He's been talking to everyone who'll listen, telling them Clara's a threat to the natural order. Says if decent white women can take up with colored men and claim their bastards are legitimate heirs, then civilization itself is at stake." Clara, who was nursing Lily while Rose slept, looked up sharply. "And people are listening?" "Some are. Jake's got friends, men who've always resented successful colored folks, men who think women should know their place. But others are starting to ask questions, like why Jake fired Samuel Washington if he was such a good worker, and why Jake's been selling off ranch stock without Clara's permission." Colt leaned against the porch railing, his eyes scanning the horizon as they always did these days. "What's Sheriff Morrison's position in all this?" "Morrison's trying to play both sides," Doc Henderson said. "He knows that letter gives Clara legal standing, but he also knows Jake has influence with some of the county officials. He's hoping the whole thing will just go away." "It won't," Clara said quietly. "Jake won't let it. He's lost too much face to back down now." That night, after Doc Henderson had ridden back to town, Colt began teaching Clara to shoot. She'd never handled a gun before. Thomas had considered such things unladylike, but Colt understood that ladylike attitudes were luxuries they could no longer afford. "It's not about being fast," he explained, positioning her hands on the grip of his spare Colt .45. "It's about being sure. Don't draw unless you mean to kill, and don't shoot unless you mean to hit." The gun was heavy in Clara's hands, heavier than she'd expected. The first few shots went wide, the recoil surprising her despite Colt's warnings. But she was determined. and Colt was patient, and by the end of an hour she could hit a target at 20 yards more often than not. "Good," he said, watching her reload with increasing confidence. "Now remember, if trouble comes, and I'm not here, you take the babies and get into the root cellar. It's got thick walls and only one entrance. You make them come to you, and you don't give them any warning shots." The thought of having to defend her children with violence made Clara's hands shake, but she nodded. "What about the ranch? If I really own it, shouldn't we be doing something to claim it?" "We are," Colt said, slowly. "First we make sure you and the girls are safe. Then we start asking questions about what Jake's done with your property." Their first ally came from an unexpected source. Mary Standing Bear, a Comanche woman who'd married a Mexican trader and lived in a small cabin on the boundary between the Whitfield Ranch and tribal lands, appeared at their door one evening with a basket of food and information. "Jake Whitfield's been cutting timber from your north section," she told Clara without preamble, "selling it to the railroad. Also been running cattle with altered brands, yours changed to his." Mary was perhaps 40 years old, with silver streaking her black hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd traded with Thomas Whitfield for years, selling him horses in exchange for beef and grain. More importantly, she had no use for white men's prejudices and less patience for their lies. "Why are you telling us this?" Clara asked. "Because Jake Whitfield cheated my husband in a horse trade last month, said the animals weren't worth what we agreed on, then took them anyway. And because those babies deserve better than to grow up poor, because some fool stole their inheritance." Mary became their eyes and ears, moving freely through the countryside in ways that neither Colt nor Clara could. She brought news of Jake's activities, warned them when groups of his supporters were planning to visit, and gradually introduced them to other families who had reasons to distrust Jake Whitfield. There were more of these families than Colt had expected. Mexican families who'd been cheated in land deals, former slaves who'd been denied wages for honest work, small ranchers who'd been forced to sell to Jake at unfair prices, Native Americans who'd been treated as thieves and savages. The people Jake dismissed as inferior had been paying attention, and they remembered every slight. "Interesting coalition you're building," Mary observed one evening as she dandled Lily on her knee while Rose slept in Clara's arms. "White woman, giant cowboy, mixed-race babies, and every person Jake Whitfield ever wronged might actually work. But building alliances took time, and Jake wasn't idle." Sheriff Morrison paid another visit to the cabin, this time alone and clearly uncomfortable. "Clara," he said, refusing Colt's offer of coffee, "I need to talk to you about those children." "What about them?" Clara's voice was cool. "Well, there's been talk, questions about their parentage. Some folks are saying that if they're not Thomas's children, then they have no claim to the Whitfield name or property." Colt stepped closer to Morrison, his presence making the smaller man nervous. "And what do you think, Sheriff?" "I think it doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what a judge might think if this goes to court. And Jake's been talking to lawyers." Clara stood, Lily in her arms, her backbone straight with determination. "Then let him take it to court. Doc Henderson has Thomas's letter, and I have these children. Let a judge decide whether love makes a family or blood does." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "It's not that simple, Clara. There are laws about legitimacy, about inheritance. And there are people who'll swear they saw you with that colored fellow while Thomas was alive." "Samuel Washington," Clara said firmly. "His name is Samuel Washington, and he was a good man who worked hard for honest wages. If people want to lie about him or about me, that's their choice. But I won't pretend to be ashamed of knowing him." After Morrison left, Colt found Clara sitting on the porch, staring out at the sunset, while the twins slept inside. There were tears on her cheeks, but her jaw was set with determination. "You're thinking this is too hard," he said, settling beside her, "thinking maybe it would be easier to take the girls and start over somewhere else." "The thought crossed my mind," she admitted, "but then I remember that Thomas wanted me to have that ranch, and Samuel worked that land with his own hands. And these babies, she gestured toward the cabin, where Rose and Lily slept in their hand-carved cradles. They're going to grow up somewhere they can be proud of who they are. Colt reached over and took her hand, calloused fingers gentle against her soft skin. Then we stay, we fight, and we show this town what a real family looks like. Inside the cabin, one of the twins began to fuss. Clara started to rise, but Colt was already moving. "I'll get her. You rest." Clara watched through the window as this strong, gentle man lifted Rose from her cradle, his voice a low rumble as he spoke to her. The baby settled immediately, trusting completely in the safety of his arms. For the first time since Thomas's death, Clara allowed herself to hope, not just for survival, but for something more, a life built on love rather than obligation. Children raised with confidence rather than shame, and a man who chose to stand with her not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The future was still uncertain, full of dangers they couldn't yet imagine. But watching Colt rock her daughter to sleep, Clara began to believe that some things were strong enough to survive whatever storm was coming. Love, properly tended, could grow even in the hardest ground. 3 months had passed since that confrontation in the cabin yard, and autumn was painting the Texas landscape in shades of gold and rust. Clara had regained her strength, the twins were thriving, and something precious was growing between her and Colt, carefully, quietly, like wildflowers taking root in rocky soil. The change began with small gestures. Colt, bringing her coffee in the morning before she fully woke, his hand brushing hers as he passed the cup. Clara mending his shirts and taking extra care with the stitching, her fingers lingering on the fabric that would rest against his skin. The way they moved around each other in the small cabin, learning the rhythm of shared space, shared responsibility, shared hope. It was Clara who made the first decisive move toward letting go of her past. On a crisp October morning, while Colt was working with the horses and the twins napped in their cradles, she walked to the old oak tree behind the cabin. The tree was ancient, its trunk scarred by decades of wind and weather, its roots running deep into the prairie soil. Clara had been drawn to it from the first day, finding comfort in its endurance. She knelt at the base of the tree and dug a small hole with her bare hands, the earth cold and rich between her fingers. From her pocket, she pulled her wedding ring, the simple gold band Thomas had placed on her finger 3 years ago, with promises of security and respectability. The ring caught the morning light as she held it one last time, remembering the young woman who had worn it, a woman who'd believed that duty was the same as love, that safety was worth more than passion, that a woman's highest calling was to be useful rather than happy. That woman was gone, buried along with the life she'd never really chosen. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd learned that love was worth fighting for, and that happiness, once found, was worth protecting at any cost. Clara placed the ring in the small hole and covered it with earth, then stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. When she turned back toward the cabin, she found Colt watching from the corral, his eyes understanding what he'd witnessed without need for explanation. That evening, after the twins were settled for the night, Clara found herself studying Colt as he sat by the fireplace, cleaning his rifle with the methodical care he brought to all his tasks. The lamplight played across his features, the strong jaw, the careful hands, the grey eyes that could be gentle as summer rain or hard as winter stone, depending on what the situation required. "Colt," she said, her voice softer than usual. He looked up from his work, setting the rifle aside and giving her his full attention. "Something on your mind?" "I buried my wedding ring today." He nodded slowly. "I saw. How do you feel about that?" "Free," she said without hesitation. "For the first time in years, I feel free." They looked at each other across the small room, the weight of unspoken feelings thick between them. Colt started to speak, then stopped, uncertainty flickering across his features. "Clara, I need you to know what's happening between us. It's not because you need protection or because I feel sorry for you. You're strong enough to stand on your own if you had to. I know, she said. That's why it matters. He stood then and crossed to where she sat, going down on one knee beside her chair so they were at eye level. I love you, he said simply. I love you and those babies, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt how precious you are. Clara felt tears start, but they were good tears, tears of relief and joy, and the overwhelming gratitude of a woman who'd found something she'd never dared hope for. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have since that first night, when you stepped between us and danger without counting the cost. Colt reached up and touched her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. Then maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is temporary. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered, but the second was deeper, full of the passion they'd been holding in check for months, the recognition that they'd found in each other something rare and precious and worth fighting for. They were interrupted by Lily's crying from the bedroom. Clara started to get up, but Colt was already moving. I'll get her, he said. You two have been doing most of the work while I'm out with the cattle. Time I pulled my weight as a father. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and commitment. Clara watched him disappear into the bedroom, heard his voice low and soothing as he comforted the baby. When he returned, Lily was quiet in his arms, her tiny fist wrapped around his finger. She's getting bigger, he said, settling back into his chair with the baby against his chest. They both are. Won't be long before they're walking and getting into everything. Clara smiled at the picture they made, this huge, gentle man and the tiny child who trusted him completely. They're going to need their own room soon, and space to play. I've been thinking about that, Colt said. About adding on to the cabin, maybe building a proper house, something big enough for a real family. That sounds expensive. It would be if we were starting from nothing, but you own one of the largest ranches in Texas, remember? Once we figure out how to claim what's rightfully yours, money won't be the problem. The reminder of their unresolved situation cast a shadow over the evening's intimacy. Jake Whitfield hadn't given up his campaign against them, and Sheriff Morrison continued to walk the line between his duty and his deals. But there had been encouraging developments too. Mary Standing Bear had brought word that several of the Mexican and Native American families were willing to work Clara's land in exchange for fair wages and honest treatment, something they'd never received from Jake. Doc Henderson continued to gather evidence of Jake's theft and mismanagement, and Preacher Williams, the elderly minister who'd served Dustwater Gulch for 20 years, had begun asking pointed questions about Christian charity and the treatment of widows and orphans. Jake came to see me yesterday, Doc Henderson had reported during his last visit. Wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify that the twins showed signs of inferior breeding. I told him what he could do with that suggestion. More significantly, some of the townspeople were beginning to shift their positions. Clara's dignified response to persecution, combined with Colt's reputation for fair dealing, was creating doubt about Jake's version of events. People were starting to ask why Jake was so eager to claim property that didn't belong to him, and why he cared so much about the parentage of children he claimed to despise. But Jake's most dangerous response wasn't legal or social, it was economic. He'd begun pressuring other ranchers not to do business with anyone who supported Clara, threatening to cut off trade relationships that went back decades. For men trying to make a living in an unforgiving landscape, such threats carried real weight. He's trying to starve us out, Mary Standing Bear explained during one of her visits. Make it impossible for you to work the land or sell cattle, force you to give up and leave. Will it work? Clara asked. Mary's smile was sharp as a blade. Not if we're smarter than he is. Jake's always thought in straight lines, force and threats and bullying. But there are other ways to move cattle, other markets to reach. The railroad's coming through 20 miles south of here next spring. They'll buy beef from anyone who can deliver it. No questions asked about the seller's skin color or family situation. That conversation led to late-night planning sessions around the cabin's kitchen table with Colt, Clara, Mary, and sometimes Doc Henderson working out strategies for reclaiming Clara's inheritance. They studied maps, calculated distances and costs, planned routes that would bypass Jake's network of supporters. It was during one of these sessions that Rose took her first steps. She'd been pulling herself up on furniture for weeks, standing shakily while holding onto chair legs or the edge of the cradle. But that night, while the adults were bent over their papers, she let go of the table and took 3 wobbling steps toward Colt before sitting down hard on her bottom. The room fell silent. Then Clara gasped, and Colt broke into a grin that transformed his entire face. "Did you see that?" he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. She walked. Rose walked. Lily, not to be outdone by her sister, immediately pulled herself up and took 2 careful steps before losing her balance and grabbing onto Mary's skirt. The women laughed, and Colt scooped both babies into his arms, spinning them gently while they giggled. "Growing up fast," Mary observed. "Soon they'll be running around, getting into everything, asking questions about why some people look at them funny." The reminder sobered them all. Rose and Lily were beautiful, happy children, but they would grow up in a world that might never fully accept them. The battles Clara and Colt were fighting now were about more than land or money. They were about creating a place where these children could thrive. "They'll be strong," Clara said, watching her daughters babble happily in Colt's arms. "And they'll know they're loved. That's more than many children have. They'll also know they can fight for what's right," Colt added, "and that sometimes standing up to bullies is the only choice worth making." As autumn deepened toward winter, their small family settled into routines that felt increasingly permanent. Colt rose before dawn to tend the animals and work on improvements to the cabin. Clara managed the household and continued learning to shoot, her accuracy improving steadily. The twins grew and explored, their laughter filling spaces that had been silent too long. But underneath the domestic peace, tension continued to build. Jake's campaign against them was intensifying, and they all knew that winter's approach would force some kind of resolution. Travel would become difficult, and isolated homesteads would be vulnerable to the kind of nighttime visits that left buildings burned and families missing. "We need to make our move before the snow flies," Colt said one evening as they watched the twins play on a blanket near the fireplace. "If we're going to claim that ranch, it has to be soon." Clara looked up from the baby dress she was mending. "What kind of move?" "Legal, public, something that forces Jake to respond in the open rather than through threats and sabotage. Doc Henderson thinks the circuit judge will be through town next month," Mary said. "Judge Patterson's got a reputation for honesty. If we can get the case before him, with Thomas's letter and documentation of Jake's theft, we might get a ruling that settles things once and for all." "And if we don't?" Clara asked. Colt's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "Then we settle it the other way." Clara reached over and covered his hand with hers. "I don't want you to become a killer because of me. I won't become anything I'm not already prepared to be," he said quietly. "But I won't let Jake Whitfield destroy what we're building here. These children deserve better than to grow up looking over their shoulders." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending leaves skittering across the yard. Winter was coming, and with it the kind of harsh weather that tested everything: relationships, resolve, and the strength of whatever shelters people had built against the storm. But inside the cabin, warmth prevailed. The twins had fallen asleep on their blanket, Rose's tiny hand resting on Lily's shoulder. Clara continued her mending while Colt worked on carving a set of wooden horses for the children to play with. Mary sat by the fire, her weathered hands busy with beadwork, her presence a reminder that they weren't fighting their battles alone. "Whatever comes," Clara said softly, "I'm grateful for this, for tonight, for this family, for the chance to love without apology." Colt looked up from his carving, wood shavings scattered around his feet. "This is just the beginning," he said. "By next spring, those babies will be running around their own ranch, playing in fields that belong to them, and anyone who doesn't like it can answer to me." The promise hung in the air like a vow, backed by the kind of quiet determination that moved mountains and changed the course of rivers. Outside, the wind continued to blow, but inside, love had taken root and was growing strong enough to weather whatever storm was coming. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of bitter cold that made even the hardiest cowboys think twice about venturing outside. But for Clara, the cold brought an unexpected gift, a trunk that Mary Standing Bear delivered one snowy morning, its contents hidden beneath layers of oiled cloth. "Found this buried behind your old house?" Mary said, stamping snow from her boots as she entered the cabin. "Jake's men were tearing through everything, looking for something. Figured if they wanted it that badly, you ought to have it instead." Clara's hands trembled as she unwrapped the cloth, revealing items she'd thought lost forever. There were photographs of her parents, her mother's pearl necklace, books she'd treasured as a teacher, and at the bottom, wrapped in faded blue silk, Samuel's guitar. The instrument was more beautiful than she'd remembered, honey-colored wood worn smooth by loving hands, silver tuning pegs that caught the lamplight, and along the neck, carved in Samuel's careful script, the words, "For Rose and Lily, with all my love." "He knew," Clara whispered, running her fingers over the inscription. "He knew about the babies before he left." Colt examined the guitar with the reverence of a man who understood craftsmanship. "This is fine work, hand-carved from what looks like aged maple. Must have taken him months to make." Clara lifted the instrument carefully, remembering the evenings when Samuel had played for her, his voice blending with the guitar's warm tones to create something beautiful in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. The strings were still tight, still in tune despite months of storage. She strummed a simple chord, and the sound filled the cabin like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Rose and Lily, who had been playing quietly nearby, looked up with sudden attention, as if recognizing something familiar and beloved. "They remember," Clara said wonderingly. "Somehow, they remember his music." Over the following weeks, Clara began teaching herself to play more than the simple melodies she'd learned by watching Samuel. Her fingers, softened by months of domestic work, gradually developed the calluses that came with regular practice. More importantly, she began teaching the twins to appreciate the music their father had left them. Rose and Lily would sit transfixed when Clara played, clapping their tiny hands and babbling along with melodies they couldn't yet understand, but somehow felt in their bones. Sometimes Clara would sing the lullabies Samuel had taught her, old songs passed down through generations of mothers who'd used music to comfort children in times of trouble. "They need to know where they came from," Clara explained to Colt one evening as she put the guitar away after the twins' bedtime. "Not just the hard parts, but the beautiful parts too. Samuel was a good man who loved them before they were born. That's part of who they are." Colt nodded, understanding instinctively that the guitar represented more than music. It was a connection to heritage, to love that transcended death, to the kind of strength that could survive hatred and loss. But not everyone in Dustwater Gulch appreciated Clara's efforts to honor Samuel's memory. Jake Whitfield's campaign against her had evolved from crude threats to more sophisticated pressure. He'd convinced several prominent townspeople that Clara's open acknowledgement of her relationship with Samuel represented a dangerous precedent if white women could freely associate with black men and expect society to accept. Results: what would become of the natural order? Sheriff Morrison delivered this message during a visit that felt more like a formal warning than a social call. "There's been talk," he said, refusing Clara's offer of coffee and remaining standing near the door as if ready to flee. "Some folks think it's unseemly for you to be well, celebrating what happened between you and that colored fellow." "Samuel Washington," Clara said firmly. "His name was Samuel Washington, and he was the father of my children. I won't pretend otherwise to make other people comfortable." "But Clara, you have to think about the children's future. If you keep flaunting their parentage, they'll never be accepted in decent society." Colt stepped forward, his presence making Morrison nervous. "Sheriff, What exactly are you suggesting? Just that maybe Clara could be more discreet. Maybe find homes for the children with families that could raise them properly. There are good Christian families who take in orphans. My children are not orphans, Clara interrupted, her voice cold as winter wind. And they don't need new families. They have one. Morrison glanced nervously at Colt, then back to Clara. I'm just trying to help. Jake's got support from some important people. Judge Patterson's coming through next month, and there's talk of challenging your claim to the ranch on moral grounds. Moral grounds? Colt's voice carried a dangerous edge. Well, if it can be proven that Clara was living in adultery while married to Thomas, and that she's continuing to promote immoral behavior by celebrating her relationship with Samuel Washington, then a judge might rule that she's unfit to inherit property or raise children. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. They want to take my children. I'm not saying that's what will happen, Morrison said quickly. I'm just saying that's what some people are talking about. Maybe if you were to show some remorse, some understanding that what happened was wrong. Get out, Colt said quietly. Now, Colt, I'm just trying to... Get out of our house, Morrison, and don't come back unless you're here to uphold the law instead of Jake Whitfield's prejudices. After Morrison left, Clara sat holding the guitar, her fingers picking out one of Samuel's lullabies, while tears ran down her cheeks. Colt knelt beside her chair, his large hands gentle on her shoulders. They can't take them, she whispered. These are my babies. They can't take them away from me. They won't, Colt said with quiet certainty. I promise you, Clara, they won't. But the threat hung over them like storm clouds, affecting every decision and conversation. They began making preparations for the possibility that legal challenges might not be enough, that they might need to disappear into the vast Texas wilderness until the immediate danger passed. Mary Standing Bear became their lifeline during this period, bringing news from town and helping them understand the forces arrayed against them. The Mexican families who worked her land had experience with disappearing when necessary, and the Comanche knew routes through the hill country that could hide a small family for months if needed. But running away means giving up the ranch, Clara pointed out during one of their planning sessions. It means Jake wins. Sometimes you have to retreat to fight another day, Mary replied pragmatically. Better to lose property than to lose children. The possibility of flight became more urgent when Doc Henderson brought disturbing news from his medical rounds. I was treating Jake's youngest boy for a broken arm yesterday, he reported. Kid fell from a horse. While I was working, I heard Jake talking to some men from Austin lawyers. By the sound of them, they were discussing something called a fitness hearing, basically a legal proceeding to determine whether you're a suitable mother. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. On what grounds? Adultery, fornication, promoting racial mixing, failure to provide proper Christian upbringing. They're building a case that you're morally unfit to raise children, especially children of mixed race, who need special guidance to overcome their natural disadvantages. Colt's hands clenched into fists. And what kind of guidance do they think these children need? Doc Henderson's expression was grim. There are institutions, Colt, places that take in mixed-race children and train them for domestic service or manual labor. They call it preparing them for their proper place in society. The idea of Rose and Lily in such places, beautiful, bright children reduced to servants because of their heritage, filled Clara with a rage that burned hotter than her fear. We fight, she said simply. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we fight. That night, after the twins were asleep, Clara played Samuel's guitar longer than usual, her fingers finding melodies that spoke of determination and defiance. The music drifted through the cabin like a prayer, touching on themes of love and loss, struggle and hope. Colt listened from his chair by the fire, understanding that this was Clara's way of gathering strength for the battles ahead. The woman who had cowered under Jake Whitfield's fists was gone, replaced by someone who would fight like a wildcat to protect her children. Play the lullaby, he said softly, the one about holding on to hope. Clara's fingers moved to the familiar melody, and her voice rose in words that Samuel had taught her. Words passed down through generations of people who'd faced impossible odds and somehow survived. Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches, and snow began to fall more heavily. Winter was tightening its grip on the land, but inside the cabin, music created its own warmth, its own promise that spring would come again, that love would endure, that children would grow up free and proud, no matter what forces tried to break them. The guitar's final notes hung in the air like a vow, and Clara set the instrument aside with the careful reverence it deserved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new tests of their resolve. But tonight, in the safety of their small cabin, surrounded by the family they'd chosen and the love they'd built, they were strong enough to face whatever storm was coming. The blizzard that struck Dustwater Gulch in January was the worst anyone could remember, bringing with it winds that howled like demons and snow that piled higher than a man's head. For 3 days, Colt, Clara, and the twins were trapped in the cabin, surviving on stored provisions and the warmth of the fireplace. But when the storm finally broke and Colt could make his way to the barn, he discovered that the forced isolation had been a blessing in disguise. Hidden in the false bottom of his tool chest was something he'd hoped never to use: his father's rifle scope, a precision instrument that had earned his father a reputation as the deadliest shot in his regiment during the Mexican War. The scope was a thing of beauty and deadly efficiency, crafted by German artisans and capable of putting a bullet exactly where it was aimed, at distances that would make most men give up and go home. Colt's father had passed it down to him along with the Silver Star, but Colt had never mounted it on any of his weapons, hoping his life would never require such lethal precision. Now, as he cleaned the snow from the barn and checked on his animals, Colt found himself thinking about distances and angles, about the approaches to his cabin and the best defensive positions for a man who might need to protect his family against overwhelming odds. Jake Whitfield had been busy during the storm, as Mary Standing Bear reported when she struggled through the drifts to check on them. "He's recruited help," she said grimly, accepting hot coffee and warming her hands by the fire. "Drifters, mostly. Men with no ties to the community, no reputation to protect. The kind who'll do anything for money and ask no questions." "How many?" Colt asked. "At least 6 that I've seen, maybe more. They're staying at the old line shack on Jake's North Range, keeping out of sight. But my husband saw them practicing with their guns, shooting at targets shaped like people." Rue. Clara, who was teaching Lily to stack wooden blocks while Rose napped, looked up sharply. "They're planning to kill us." "Looks that way," Mary confirmed. "Jake's given up on legal solutions. Figure if you're all dead, questions about the ranch ownership become moot. He can claim you died in an accident: storm, fire, Indian raid, whatever sounds most believable." Colt stood and walked to the window, studying the landscape with new eyes. His cabin was defensible, but only against a small force. 6 or more armed men, attacking at night or during bad weather, could overwhelm even the best preparations. "We need help," he said finally. "This isn't something I can handle alone." "You're not alone," Mary said firmly. "There are others who remember what justice looks like. Mexican families who Jake's cheated, freed slaves who know what it means to fight for freedom, white folks who are sick of being told what to think by bullies like Jake Whitfield." Over the following weeks, as winter slowly loosened its grip on the land, an unlikely alliance began to form around Clara's kitchen table. Pablo Morales, whose family had lost their land to Jake through forged documents, brought his 3 sons and their knowledge of the country. Ezra Johnson, a former slave who'd been denied wages for 6 months of honest work, contributed his military experience from the Union Army. Even Preacher Williams, moved by the sight of healthy children threatened by men's hatred, offered the sanctuary of his church and his considerable moral authority. "This ain't about taking sides in your family dispute," Ezra explained to the group, during one of their planning sessions. This is about standing up to men who think they can take whatever they want, hurt whoever they please, just because they got the power to do it. Colt found himself in the unlikely position of military commander for a force that included people Jake Whitfield would have dismissed as inferior. But as they planned their defense of the cabin and the eventual confrontation with Jake's hired guns, Colt discovered that prejudice was a luxury he'd never been able to afford. Pablo's sons knew every trail and hiding place for 20 miles around. Ezra had fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the war and understood tactics that could turn a smaller force's disadvantages into strengths. Mary Standing Bear had connections throughout the territory and could coordinate movements that would keep Jake's men guessing about their numbers and positions. "We're not trying to win a war," Colt explained as they studied hand-drawn maps of the area. "We're trying to survive until Judge Patterson arrives and we can settle this legally. But if Jake forces a fight, we need to be ready to give him one. He'll remember." The preparations were both military and domestic. While the men cleaned weapons and scouted positions, Clara and Mary worked on contingency plans for the twins. If the cabin came under attack, Rose and Lily would be hidden in the root cellar behind a false wall that Colt had constructed during the long winter nights. The hiding place was stocked with food, water, and warm clothes, and it could be sealed from the inside if necessary. "I hate thinking about them scared and hiding in the dark," Clara said as she checked the supplies once more. "Better scared and hiding than captured." Mary replied pragmatically. "Jake's made it clear what he thinks should happen to mixed-race children. They're safer in a cellar than in his hands." As winter gave way to early spring, the tension around Dustwater Gulch became palpable. Jake's hired guns were no longer staying hidden, instead riding through town in groups, making it clear that anyone who opposed Jake Whitfield might face consequences. Sheriff Morrison had essentially abdicated his responsibility, refusing to arrest anyone or investigate complaints about intimidation. The crisis came to a head on a warm March evening when Doc Henderson arrived at the cabin with blood on his shirt and terror in his eyes. "They burned out the Johnson family," he gasped, accepting the whiskey Colt offered. "Ezra, his wife, his children, someone set fire to their cabin while they slept. They barely got out alive." Clara felt her stomach drop. "Are they hurt?" "Smoke inhalation, some burns. They'll live, but they lost everything. And Jake's men made sure everyone knew why it happened. Punishment for supporting you." Colt's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "Where's the family now?" "Preacher Williams is hiding them in the church. But Colt, there's more. Jake's planning to petition Judge Patterson for an emergency hearing about the children. He's claiming that recent events prove you can't protect them, that they need to be placed in protective custody until the ownership question is settled." "Protective custody with whom?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "With him as their closest male relative by marriage. He's got papers drawn up, witnesses prepared to testify about your unfitness as a mother. If Patterson believes his story, you could lose Rose and Lily before you ever get a chance to present your case." Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. She walked to where Samuel's guitar leaned against the wall and picked it up, her fingers finding a melody that spoke of rage and determination in equal measure. "When is the hearing?" she asked, without stopping her playing. 3 days. Patterson's arriving Tuesday, and Jake wants this settled before any other business comes before the court." Colt was already moving, checking the loads in his weapons and gathering the equipment he'd hoped never to need. "Then we settle it our way first. Before Patterson arrives, before Jake gets his chance to lie to a judge." "Colt, no," Clara said, setting down the guitar. "If you kill Jake, you'll be a murderer in the eyes of the law. They'll hang you, and I'll lose you too. And if I don't stop him, you'll lose those babies. Clara, some things are worth hanging for." Mary Standing Bear had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke with the authority of someone who'd survived decades of conflict. "There's another way," she said. "Not murder, but justice. Jake's got hired guns. but he's also got secrets. Things he's done that even his supporters might not stomach if they knew the truth. What kind of secrets? Doc Henderson asked. Mary's smile was sharp as a knife. The kind that involve missing Mexican families, altered brands on stolen cattle, and money that should have gone to the territorial government for land purchases. Jake Whitfield's not just a racist, he's a thief, and maybe worse. Over the next 2 days, while Jake prepared for his legal ambush and his hired guns made final preparations for what they assumed would be a quick and brutal elimination of opposition, Mary's network of allies gathered evidence that would destroy Jake's reputation and his legal standing. Pablo Morales and his sons located the graves of Mexican ranchers who'd disappeared after refusing Jake's offers to buy their land. Ezra Johnson, despite the attack on his family, managed to identify witnesses who'd seen Jake's men altering cattle brands. Even Preacher Williams contributed, producing records of church donations that showed Jake had been skimming money intended for widow and orphan relief. "We're not going to kill him," Colt explained to Clara as he mounted his father's scope on his best rifle, checking the alignment with the precision of a craftsman. "We're going to expose him, but if he tries to take those children, if he comes here with violence, then I'll do what needs doing." Clara watched him work, understanding that the gentleman who'd carved cradles for her babies was also a warrior who would kill to protect them. It should have frightened her, but instead she felt a deep sense of security. Whatever came, her children would not face it defenseless. On Monday night, the night before Judge Patterson's arrival, Clara played Samuel's guitar for what might be the last time in the cabin that had become their sanctuary. The music drifted through the rooms where Rose and Lily slept peacefully, where she and Colt had found love, where a family had been born from courage and hope. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when everything they'd built would either stand or fall. But tonight, surrounded by the people who'd chosen to stand with them, Clara played melodies of love and loss, of struggle and triumph, of children who would grow up free no matter what the cost. Outside, spring was coming to the Texas plains, bringing with it the promise of new growth, new possibilities, new chances for justice to take root in ground that had been watered with too much blood and tears. The guitar's notes carried that promise into the darkness, a song of hope that would endure whatever storm the morning might bring. Judge Patterson arrived in Dustwater Gulch on the Tuesday morning stage. A thin man in his 60s with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing, at least not until he'd heard all the evidence. He set up court in the town hall, a cramped building that normally hosted church socials and town meetings, but would today determine the fate of a family. Jake Whitfield arrived early, dressed in his finest clothes and surrounded by his supporters. His hired guns remained conspicuously absent. This was to be a legal victory, clean and respectable, the kind that would give him moral authority to finish what he'd started. Clara came with Colt, carrying Rose while he held Lily, their small procession including Doc Henderson, Mary Standing Bear, and Preacher Williams. The twins, now walking steadily and chattering in their own mysterious language, seemed oblivious to the tension that filled the room like smoke. But before Judge Patterson could call the proceedings to order, Doc Henderson stood and requested permission to present evidence that would be material to the court's understanding of the parties involved. "What kind of evidence?" Patterson asked, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent decades sorting truth from lies. "Evidence concerning the true nature of Thomas Whitfield's will and the circumstances surrounding the plaintiff's claims to authority over the defendant's children." Jake's face flushed red. "Your Honor, this is clearly a delaying tactic. The issues before the court are simple: whether Mrs. Whitfield is a fit mother for children born of adultery, and whether those children should be placed in the care of responsible family members." "I'll be the judge of what's relevant," Patterson said dryly. "Proceed, Doctor." Doc Henderson approached the bench with a leather portfolio that looked official and substantial. Your Honor, I have here the original will of Thomas Whitfield, written in his own hand 3 days before his death and witnessed by myself and Preacher Williams. He handed the document to Patterson, who examined it carefully. The courtroom held its breath as the judge read, his expression revealing nothing. "This appears to be a valid will," Patterson said finally. "It leaves the entire Whitfield estate to Clara Whitfield, including any children she may bear during or after our marriage. Doctor, can you authenticate this document?" "I can, Your Honor. I watched Thomas write it during his final illness. He was concerned about what would happen to his wife if his brothers attempted to claim his property." Jake shot to his feet. "That's impossible. Thomas never mentioned any will to his family. Besides, even if such a document exists, it doesn't change the fact that those children are bastards, born of adultery with a colored man." Judge Patterson's eyes fixed on Jake with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "Mr. Whitfield, do you have evidence to support that claim? Just look at them." Jake gestured wildly toward Rose and Lily. "Any fool can see they're not white children." "I see 2 healthy children," Patterson said coolly. "What I don't see is proof of their parentage beyond your speculation. Do you have witnesses to this alleged adultery?" Jake hesitated, realizing that his planned testimony might not be as convincing as he'd hoped. "Well, there were rumors." "Rumors are not evidence, Mr. Whitfield. Do you have factual proof of misconduct?" That was when Mary Standing Bear stood, her weathered hands steady as she approached the bench with her own documents. "Your Honor, I have here copies of land sales, cattle transactions, and financial records that show Mr. Jake Whitfield has been systematically stealing from the estate he now claims to represent." She handed over a thick folder. "Bank records show that Mr. Whitfield has sold over 200 head of cattle bearing the Thomas Whitfield brand, depositing the proceeds in his own account. He's also sold timber rights and water access without legal authority, and he's fired long-time employees in order to replace them with workers who'll accept lower wages." Jake's face went white. "Those are lies. I was managing the ranch for the family." "Without legal authority?" Patterson interrupted, studying the documents. "Mrs. Standing Bear, how did you come by these records?" "Through my husband's trading relationships with various banks and businesses in the territory. Mr. Whitfield wasn't particularly careful about covering his tracks, since he assumed no one would question his authority. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come." Preacher Williams rose slowly, his aged frame carrying the weight of moral authority accumulated over decades of service. "Your Honor, I have something else the court should hear, a confession." He pulled out a letter written in shaking handwriting. "This is from Thomas Whitfield, given to me under the seal of confession just before his death. He asked me to reveal its contents only if his wife or children were ever threatened." Patterson gestured for the letter. As he read, his expression grew progressively grimmer. "This is highly irregular," he said finally, "but given the circumstances, I believe it's admissible. Preacher Williams, would you summarize the contents for the court?" Williams nodded, his voice carrying the gravity of a man delivering a sermon on Judgment Day. "Thomas Whitfield confesses that he knew about his wife's relationship with Samuel Washington. Furthermore, he states that he gave his blessing to that relationship because he was unable to provide Clara with children of his own." The courtroom erupted. Jake's supporters began shouting, while Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Colt's hand found hers, steadying her as the implications sank in. "Silence!" Patterson's gavel crashed down repeatedly. "Preacher Williams, continue." "Thomas writes that he suffered from an injury during his military service that left him unable to father children. When he learned that Clara had found love with Samuel and that she was carrying children who would bear the Whitfield name, he was grateful rather than angry. He considered Rose and Lily to be his daughters in every way that mattered." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. His entire case had been built on the assumption that Clara had betrayed her marriage vows, that the children were evidence of adultery and moral failure. But if Thomas had known and approved... "There's more," Preacher Williams continued. "Thomas specifically states that if anything happens to him, Clara should feel free to remarry and raise the children as she sees fit. He names Samuel Washington as a good man who will provide for my family when I cannot. Judge Patterson set the letter aside and fixed Jake with a stare that could have melted steel. Mr. Whitfield, in light of this evidence, do you wish to continue your petition for custody of these children? Jake looked around the courtroom, seeing his support evaporating as people processed what they'd heard. The moral authority he'd claimed, the righteous indignation about adultery and racial mixing, had been built on lies. "This is all fabricated," he sputtered. "My brother would never have approved of such degeneracy. Are you calling Preacher Williams a liar?" Patterson's voice was deadly quiet. Jake realized he'd trapped himself. To deny the letter's authenticity meant accusing the town's most respected moral authority of fraud. But accepting it meant admitting that his entire campaign had been based on false premises. Before he could answer, Doc Henderson stood again. "Your Honor, there's one more document the court should see." He produced a final paper from his portfolio. "This is a formal complaint against Jake Whitfield, filed by the Territorial Land Office. It alleges fraud in connection with the sale of government land, including the use of forged documents and intimidation of legitimate buyers." Clara watched Jake's face as the walls closed in around him. The man who'd threatened her children, who'd beaten her while she was weak from childbirth, who'd tried to steal her inheritance, he was being exposed as the criminal he'd always been. "Furthermore," Doc Henderson continued, "I have here statements from several Mexican families who can testify that Mr. Whitfield used violence and fraud to acquire their land. There are also witnesses who can place him at the scene when the Johnson family's cabin was burned 3 nights ago." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even Jake's remaining supporters were beginning to edge toward the exits, understanding that association with him had become dangerous. Judge Patterson gathered all the documents and studied them for long minutes while everyone waited. Finally, he looked up, his decision written clearly on his face. "Based on the evidence presented, I find that Clara Whitfield is the legal owner of the Thomas Whitfield estate, including all land, livestock, and assets. Her ownership of this property is clear and uncontested." He turned to Clara, his expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Whitfield, regarding the custody of your children, I find no evidence of unfitness or moral failure. On the contrary, the evidence suggests that you are a devoted mother, raising children in accordance with your late husband's wishes." Then, his gaze fixed on Jake like a rifle sight finding its target. "Mr. Whitfield, you are hereby ordered to return all property, livestock, and funds stolen from the estate. Additionally, I'm issuing a warrant for your arrest on charges of theft, fraud, and arson. Sheriff Morrison, I trust you'll execute this warrant immediately." Sheriff Morrison, who had been trying to make himself invisible in the back of the courtroom, stepped forward reluctantly. "Your Honor, I'm not sure that's necessary. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement." "Sheriff," Patterson's voice cut through the excuse like a blade, "are you refusing to execute a lawful warrant?" Morrison's face went pale as he realized his cozy arrangement with Jake had just become a liability that could cost him his badge and possibly his freedom. "No, Your Honor, I'll execute the warrant." But Jake Whitfield wasn't going to surrender quietly. As Morrison approached with handcuffs, Jake's hand dropped to his gun, the same move that had intimidated so many others over the years. This time, it was a fatal mistake. Colt had been watching Jake throughout the proceedings, reading the growing desperation in the man's eyes, the way his hand kept twitching toward his weapon. When Jake's fingers closed around the grip of his pistol, Colt was already moving. The big Cowboy's draw was faster than anyone expected, his Colt .45 clearing leather and firing before Jake's gun was halfway out of its holster. The bullet took Jake in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the wooden floor. The courtroom erupted in screams and shouts as people dove for cover. But Colt kept his gun trained on Jake, his voice calm and steady. "Stay down, Jake, it's over." Judge Patterson, who had seen his share of courtroom violence during his years on the bench, remained seated and composed. "Sheriff Morrison, please secure the prisoner and tend to his wound. Mr. Braddock, I assume you were acting in defense of the court." "Yes, sir," Colt replied, holstering his weapon. "Jake was drawing on you and the sheriff." Patterson nodded. "So I observed. Thank you for your quick action." As Doc Henderson moved to tend Jake's wound and Morrison finally placed him under arrest, the full magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. Clara owned one of the largest ranches in Texas. Her children were safe from legal challenges. And Jake Whitfield, the man who had terrorized her for months, was finished. But the victory felt incomplete, shadowed by the knowledge that Jake's hired guns were still out there, still dangerous, still committed to a cause that had just been legally destroyed. Mary Standing Bear seemed to read Clara's thoughts. "Don't worry about Jake's men," she said quietly. "Without Jake to pay them, and with warrants likely to be issued for their involvement in the Johnson fire, they'll be riding hard for the territorial borders within the hour." She was right. By evening, word had spread throughout Dustwater Gulch that Jake's hired guns had scattered like leaves before a storm, apparently deciding that their employer's legal troubles made the area unhealthy for men with questionable pasts. That night, Clara sat in the kitchen of her own ranch house, the house she'd been driven from months ago, nursing Lily, while Rose played at her feet. The rooms felt different now, cleaned of Jake's presence and the hatred he'd brought with him. Through the windows, she could see Colt moving among the cattle in the evening light, taking inventory of what was hers. The ranch was larger than she'd remembered, more prosperous than Thomas had ever let her know. The books that Jake had tried to hide showed hundreds of head of prime cattle, extensive water rights, and land that stretched to the horizon in 3 directions. She was, Clara realized with amazement, one of the wealthiest women in Texas. But more important than the money was what the victory represented. Her children would grow up as the legitimate heirs to a substantial estate. They would never know poverty or the kind of desperation that forced people to accept whatever scraps society offered them. They would have choices, opportunities, the chance to become whatever they were capable of becoming. Doc Henderson stopped by as the sun was setting, ostensibly to check on everyone's health, but really to satisfy himself that justice had truly been served. "Jake's going to recover from his wound," he reported, "but he's looking at serious prison time. The territorial authorities are very interested in his activities, especially the business with the Mexican families. Seems there's been a pattern of violence and fraud stretching back several years." "What about Sheriff Morrison?" Clara asked. Patterson suspended him pending investigation. "There'll be a new sheriff appointed within the week, someone without ties to Jake's organization." Clara nodded, understanding that the changes went beyond her personal situation. Dustwater Gulch itself was being transformed, freed from the grip of men who had ruled through fear and prejudice. "There's something else," Doc Henderson said, pulling a letter from his coat. "This came on today's stage. It's from Samuel Washington." Clara's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Samuel's careful handwriting addressed it to Mrs. Clara Whitfield, in care of Dr. Henderson, Dustwater Gulch, Texas. She opened it with the reverence due a message from the dead, though she knew Samuel was very much alive somewhere in the vast territories to the north. The letter was brief but filled with love and longing. "My dearest Clara, word has reached me of the troubles you've faced and of the good man who has stood by you and our daughters. I know you must think me a coward for leaving, but I could not bear the thought of my presence bringing more danger to you and the children. I am working now in Colorado Territory, where a man's worth is measured by his work rather than his color. I have been saving money with the hope that someday, when it is safe, I might see you and our daughters again. But if that day never comes, know that you carry my love with you always. Raise Rose and Lily to be strong and proud. Tell them their father loved them before they were born and will love them until his last breath. The guitar was my gift to them. May they find in music the joy and strength that carried me through the darkest times. All my love, Samuel. Clara wiped away tears as she finished reading. Through the window, she could see Colt returning from his inspection of the cattle, his tall figure moving with the easy confidence of a man who belonged on this land. Two good men had loved her, each in his own way, each offering what he could to protect her and the children. Thomas had given her security and legal protection through his will. Samuel had given her passion and beautiful daughters. And Colt had given her courage, safety, and the promise of a future built on love rather than obligation. That evening, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching Rose and Lily chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Clara made a decision. "I want to write to Samuel," she told Colt. "I want him to know that Rose and Lily are safe, that they're growing up strong and happy. And I want him to know about you, about the man who chose to be their father when he didn't have to." Colt was quiet for a long moment, watching the children play. "What will you tell him about us?" "The truth, that I love you, that we're building a life together, and that his daughters will grow up knowing they had three fathers, one who gave them life, one who gave them legitimacy, and one who gave them protection and love." Colt reached over and took her hand. "And what about the future? This ranch is big enough for a lot of dreams." Clara smiled, thinking of all the possibilities that stretched before them. "I want to make it a place where all children can grow up safe, where the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth don't determine their worth, where families like ours can exist without apology." In the distance, they could hear music drifting from the bunkhouse, where some of the Mexican workers were celebrating the day's victory with guitars and songs. The sound mixed with the laughter of Rose and Lily, creating a symphony of hope that seemed to rise from the very soil of Texas. The future was still uncertain, still filled with challenges and struggles. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Clara felt truly free, free to love without fear, free to raise her children in safety, free to build something lasting and beautiful from the ashes of hatred and loss. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new decisions about how to run a vast ranch and care for the people who depended on it. But tonight, surrounded by love and protected by justice, Clara Whitfield was exactly where she belonged. 3 months had passed since Judge Patterson's ruling, and spring was painting the Texas landscape in shades of green and gold that seemed to promise endless possibilities. Clara had settled into her role as ranch owner with a confidence that surprised even her, making decisions about cattle drives and land management with the practical wisdom of someone who'd learned that survival required both strength and intelligence. But success brought its own dangers. The news that a woman, especially one with mixed-race children, had legally defeated Jake Whitfield and claimed ownership of a major ranch had spread throughout Texas and beyond. Some saw it as a victory for justice, proof that the law could protect the innocent regardless of their circumstances. Others viewed it as a dangerous precedent that threatened the natural order of society. It was Colt who first noticed the strangers. They arrived in small groups over several weeks, never more than 2 or 3 at a time, taking rooms at the hotel in town or camping on the outskirts of Dustwater Gulch. They claimed to be traveling through, looking for work, or conducting business in the area. But Colt's trained eye caught details that marked them as something more dangerous: the way they sat their horses, the quality of their weapons, the careful way they observed everything while seeming to pay attention to nothing. "Professional guns," he told Clara one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Rose and Lily play with a litter of puppies that had appeared from somewhere in the vast ranch. "Not like Jake's hired thugs. These men have military training, real experience. Someone with serious money is backing them." Clara felt the familiar chill of fear, but it was tempered now by the confidence that came from having successfully defended her family once before. "How many?" "Hard to say. I've counted at least 8, but there could be more. They're being careful not to gather in one place or make themselves obvious." Mary Standing Bear had been tracking the strangers as well, using her network of contacts throughout the territory to piece together information about their origins and intentions. "They're not from Texas," she reported during one of her visits. "At least 3 of them came down from Kansas, 2 more from Colorado territory. Someone's been recruiting across a wide area, looking for men with specific skills." "What kind of skills?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The kind that come from fighting Indians, hunting outlaws, and doing the sort of work that decent folks don't ask questions about. These aren't cowboys looking for ranch jobs. They're killers, plain and simple." The realization that they were facing a coordinated threat rather than random violence changed everything. This wasn't about Jake Whitfield's personal hatred anymore. It was about something larger, more organized, and infinitely more dangerous. Doc Henderson brought disturbing news from his travels to other towns in the region. "There's been talk," he said grimly. "Meetings in Austin, letters from concerned citizens, editorials in newspapers about the danger of allowing unnatural family arrangements to stand. Some people see what happened here as the first crack in the foundation of white society." Colt had been cleaning his father's compass while they talked, the brass instrument gleaming in the lamplight. The compass had been his father's most prized possession, a gift from his commanding officer for service above and beyond the call of duty. It had guided his father through the trackless wilderness of the Mexican War, always pointing true north, no matter how lost or confused the situation became. Now Colt found himself thinking about moral compasses, about the difference between what was legal and what was right, about the kind of courage that kept a man moving forward even when the path ahead was unclear. "We could leave," he said finally. "Take the children and disappear into the territories. Start over somewhere they'd never find us." Clara looked at him sharply. "Is that what you want to do?" "I want to keep you and those babies safe. Everything else is secondary. But running away means giving up everything we've fought for. It means letting them win." Colt nodded slowly, understanding the dilemma. They'd proven that justice could triumph over hatred, that love could overcome prejudice, that a family built on choice could be stronger than one built on blood. But holding on to those victories required continued vigilance, continued courage, continued willingness to face whatever came next. "Then we stay," he said, "and we prepare for war." The preparations began immediately. Colt sent word to their allies, Pablo Morales and his sons, Ezra Johnson and his extended family, the Mexican workers who'd found fair treatment on Clara's ranch, and even some of the townspeople who'd been quietly supportive during the legal proceedings. "This isn't just about protecting one family anymore," Colt explained to the group gathered in the ranch house parlor. "If they can eliminate Clara and the children, if they can prove that challenging the established order leads to death, then no one will ever try to stand up to injustice again." Ezra Johnson, his face still bearing scars from the fire that had destroyed his home, nodded grimly. "We understand the stakes. Question is, do we have enough men to make a real fight of it?" "We have something better than numbers," Mary Standing Bear said. "We have the advantage of fighting for our homes, our families, our future. They're fighting for money and an idea about racial purity that most of them probably don't even understand." Colt had been studying maps of the ranch and the surrounding area, planning defensive positions and escape routes with the methodical care of a military commander. The ranch headquarters was defensible, built on a slight rise with clear sightlines in all directions and solid stone construction that could withstand rifle fire. But the real advantage lay in the terrain itself, rolling hills, hidden valleys, and creek beds that could provide cover for defenders who knew the land. "If they come," he said, tracing routes on the map with his finger, "they'll try to hit us at night, probably during the new moon, when the darkness gives them cover. But darkness works both ways. We know every rock and tree on this land. They don't." Clara had insisted on being part of the planning, despite Colt's concerns about involving her in military preparations. She'd proven herself capable with weapons, And more importantly, she understood that this was her fight as much as anyone's. "What about Rose and Lily?" she asked. "If shooting starts, where do we put them?" Mary Standing Bear had been thinking about that problem as well. "My people have a hidden camp in the hills, about 10 miles north. It's defendable, well supplied, and the children would be safe there while we deal with the threat." "No," Clara said firmly. "I won't be separated from my children. If we're making a stand, we make it together." Colt understood her position, but the tactical part of his mind rebelled against the idea of defending children during a gunfight. "Clara, if something happens to you, if something happens to me, at least Rose and Lily will know their mother didn't abandon them. They'll grow up understanding that some things are worth fighting for, even dying for." In the end, they compromised. The children would be moved to the most secure part of the ranch house, a stone-walled room that had originally been designed as a fortress against Indian raids. Mary Standing Bear would stay with them, armed and ready to fight if the defensive perimeter was breached. But if the situation became hopeless, she had permission to take Rose and Lily to the hidden camp, ensuring that at least the children would survive to carry on their parents' legacy. As the days passed and the threat grew more imminent, Colt found himself thinking often about his father's compass and what it meant to always point toward true north. In the moral landscape they were navigating, true north meant protecting the innocent, standing up to bullies, and proving that love was stronger than hatred. But he also understood that sometimes pointing toward true north meant being willing to kill. The hired guns had been gathering supplies and weapons, preparing for what looked like a coordinated assault. They'd rented a house on the outskirts of town, far enough from prying eyes to conduct their planning in secret. But Mary Standing Bear's network had infiltrated even that sanctuary, bringing back intelligence about numbers, weapons, and timing. 12 men, she reported. All experienced fighters. They've got rifles, pistols, and enough ammunition for a siege. They're planning to hit the ranch tomorrow night, during the new moon. Colt nodded, feeling the familiar calm that came before violence. He'd hoped it would never come to this, but he was ready. His father's rifle scope was mounted and zeroed, his weapons cleaned and loaded, his mind focused on the task ahead. "Everyone knows their positions?" he asked the assembled defenders. Nods all around. Pablo and his sons would cover the eastern approach. Ezra and his men would watch the southern route. Colt would take the most dangerous position, the open ground to the west, where attackers would have the best cover. "Remember," he said, "we're not trying to win a war. We're trying to survive until help arrives. Doc Henderson's already sent word to the territorial authorities. If we can hold out until dawn, reinforcements should reach us by noon." Clara checked her weapons one final time, the Colt .945 that Colt had taught her to use, and a shotgun that would be devastating at close range. She'd practiced until her accuracy was reliable at any range she was likely to encounter, and her hands no longer shook when she pulled the trigger. "Whatever happens," she said to the group, "I want you all to know that you're fighting for something bigger than one family. You're fighting for the idea that decent people can stand up to evil and win." As the sun set on what might be their last peaceful evening, Colt and Clara sat on the porch one final time, watching Rose and Lily play in the fading light. The children were oblivious to the danger, secure in the love that surrounded them, innocent of the hatred that had marked them for death before they could even walk. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Clara asked, "staying and fighting instead of running?" Colt pulled out his father's compass, watching the needle swing toward magnetic north with unwavering certainty. "Sometimes," he said, "a man has to choose between being safe and being right. My father chose right, even when it meant riding into Mexican cannons. I think he'd understand what we're doing here." The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, nightbirds were beginning their ancient songs. Tomorrow would bring violence and danger, but tonight there was still peace, still love, still the promise that good could triumph over evil if people were willing to fight for it. Colt reached over and took Clara's hand, feeling the calluses that had developed from months of ranch work, the strength that came from surviving everything life had thrown at her. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "you've already won. Those children will grow up knowing they were loved, knowing they mattered, knowing their mother was the strongest woman in Texas." Clara smiled, understanding that some victories were measured not in land or money, but in the legacy left for the next generation. Win or lose, Rose and Lily would inherit something precious. The knowledge that their parents had refused to bow to hatred, had chosen love over fear, had proven that family was about more than blood. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the wind carried the scent of rain. Change was coming to the Texas plains, the kind of change that would either wash the land clean or flood it with blood. But whatever the morning brought, they would face it together, pointing steadily toward their own true north. The attack came at 3 in the morning, during the darkest hour, when the new moon offered no light to betray movement across the rolling prairie. Colt had been awake for hours, positioned behind a stone wall with his rifle, his father's scope giving him clear vision even in the darkness. The professional killers approached exactly as he'd predicted, spread out, disciplined, using every fold in the ground to mask their advance. He counted 12 figures moving through the night, confirming Mary Standing Bear's intelligence. They were good, better than anything Jake Whitfield could have afforded on his own. Someone with serious resources had assembled this force, and they moved with the precision of men who'd done this kind of work before. The first shot came from Pablo Morales' position to the east, where one of the attackers had tried to use the creek bed for cover. The sound shattered the night silence, and suddenly the darkness exploded with muzzle flashes as both sides opened fire. Colt found his first target, a man trying to reach the cover of the barn. The scope brought the figure into sharp focus, and Colt's finger squeezed the trigger with the careful precision his father had taught him. The man dropped, his rifle clattering against the wooden fence. "That's one," Colt muttered, already searching for his next target. Inside the stone-walled room of the ranch house, Clara held Rose and Lily close, while Mary Standing Bear watched the windows with her shotgun ready. The children had awakened to the sound of gunfire, but instead of crying, they seemed to sense the gravity of the situation and remained quietly alert. "Mama," Rose whispered, her small hand touching Clara's face. "It's all right, sweetheart," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Papa's taking care of us." Through the thick stone walls, they could hear the battle raging outside. Rifles cracked like thunder, and occasionally a man's voice would cry out in pain or anger. The professional killers had expected to overwhelm a handful of ranch hands and civilians. Instead, they found themselves facing determined defenders who knew every inch of the ground and had everything to lose. Ezra Johnson's position to the south was taking heavy fire. The attackers had concentrated their efforts there, trying to break through where the defensive line was thinnest. But Ezra and his men held firm, their military experience showing as they made every shot count. Colt's scope found another target, the apparent leader of the assault, a tall man directing others from behind a stone outcropping. The range was long, nearly 300 yards, but Colt's father had made shots like this during the war, and the scope was every bit as accurate as family legend claimed. The bullet took the leader center mass, spinning him around and dropping him behind the rocks. With their commander down, the attackers' coordination began to falter. Some continued the assault, but others pulled back, uncertain about their orders. "Keep them pinned," Colt shouted to his defenders. "Don't let them regroup." But the professional killers weren't finished. Even without their leader, they had enough experience to adapt their tactics. 3 of them began circling toward the north, trying to reach the ranch house from an unexpected direction. It was Clara who spotted them first, their shadows moving against the lighter background of the night sky. She left Rose and Lily with Mary Standing Bear and took position at a north-facing window, her shotgun ready. The killers reached the house before anyone could stop them, and Clara heard the sound of breaking glass from the main parlor. They were inside, moving through rooms she'd furnished with such care, bringing violence into the home where her children slept. Heavy footsteps approached the stone room where they'd taken refuge. Clara raised her shotgun, her hands steady despite the hammering of her heart. Whatever happened, these men would not reach her daughters. The door exploded inward as one of the killers tried to kick it open. Clara's shotgun roared, the blast catching the man's center mass and hurling him backward into the hallway. The second attacker appeared in the doorway, his pistol raised, but Mary Standing Bear's rifle spoke first, dropping him beside his companion. The third man was more cautious, calling out from somewhere in the house. "Mrs. Whitfield, we know you're in there. Come out now, and we'll make this quick for you and the children." Clara reloaded her shotgun, her movements automatic and efficient. "The only thing that's going to be quick," she called back, "is your trip to hell." Outside, the battle continued to rage. Pablo's position had held against repeated assaults, but his ammunition was running low. Ezra's men were still fighting hard, but they'd taken casualties, at least 2 wounded, maybe more. Colt continued to work with deadly precision, his rifle accounting for 4 of the attackers. But the professional killers were adapting, using suppressing fire to keep the defenders pinned while they maneuvered for better positions. The turning point came when Doc Henderson arrived with reinforcements, not the territorial authorities they'd hoped for, but a group of townspeople who decided they couldn't stand by while their neighbors fought for their lives. Preacher Williams was among them, carrying an old army rifle and looking grimmer than anyone had ever seen him. The sudden appearance of additional defenders from an unexpected direction threw the attackers into confusion. Caught between 2 forces and unable to coordinate their response, the professional killers began to break. 3 of them tried to flee toward their horses, but Colt's scope found them in the darkness. His rifle spoke 3 times in rapid succession, and 3 men fell before they could reach their mounts. The remaining attackers, realizing their position was hopeless, attempted a desperate final assault on the ranch house. But they ran directly into the concentrated fire of defenders who had every reason to fight with desperate courage. When the sun finally rose over the Texas plains, 12 bodies lay scattered around the ranch headquarters. Not one of the professional killers had survived to report back to whoever had sent them. Clara emerged from the stone room, carrying Rose and Lily, both children unharmed but wide-eyed from their first experience with the kind of violence that seemed to follow their family. Colt met them on the porch, his rifle still in his hands, his clothes stained with dirt and sweat, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. "It's over," he said simply. "They're all dead." Clara looked out over the battlefield where men had died trying to destroy her family and felt no sympathy for their fate. They had come as killers, and they had died as killers deserved to die. "Who were they?" she asked. "Who sent them?" Doc Henderson was examining the bodies, looking for identification or clues about their origins. Most carried nothing that would identify them, but the leader had a letter in his pocket, payment instructions from a bank in Austin, signed by someone calling himself a friend of order. "Professional work," Colt observed, reading over the doctor's shoulder. "Someone with serious money and connections, but smart enough to keep their name off any documents." Mary Standing Bear studied the letter as well, her weathered face thoughtful. "This isn't over," she said finally. "Whoever sent these men won't give up just because one attempt failed. They'll send more, or they'll try a different approach." Clara understood the implications. The victory was real but temporary. As long as she and her children represented a threat to the established order, there would always be men willing to kill them for the right price. But looking at the bodies scattered around her property, Clara also understood something else. They had faced the worst that hatred could throw at them, and they had not merely survived, they had triumphed. Rose and Lily would grow up knowing that their family was strong enough to protect them, that love was indeed more powerful than hate, that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. "Let them come," she said quietly, holding her daughters close. "We'll be ready." The territorial authorities arrived 3 hours after the shooting stopped, led by Marshal William Hayes, a man whose reputation for fairness had made him enemies among those who preferred their justice bought and paid for. He surveyed the battlefield with the experienced eye of someone who'd seen too much violence, but his expression remained neutral as he questioned the survivors. 12 dead men, he observed, kneeling beside one of the bodies. Professional killers, by the look of their equipment. Someone paid good money for this raid. Clara stood on her porch holding Lily, while Rose clung to her skirt, both children subdued by the morning's events. The sight of armed strangers, even territorial lawmen, made them nervous after the night's violence. "They came to kill my children," Clara said simply. "We defended ourselves." Marshal Hayes examined the letter Doc Henderson had found, his face growing increasingly grim as he read the payment instructions and coded references to eliminating the problem permanently. "This is bigger than a local dispute," he said finally. "Someone with serious resources and political connections organized this. The question is who and whether they'll try again." Colt had been checking on the wounded defenders. Pablo's youngest son had taken a bullet in the shoulder, and one of Ezra's men had a grazed scalp that bled dramatically but wasn't serious. All would recover, but the cost of victory was written in blood and trauma that would take time to heal. "Marshal," Colt said, approaching with his father's compass in his hand, "what kind of protection can the territorial government provide? Because whoever sent these men isn't going to give up just because one attack failed." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing political realities against moral obligations. "Officially, I can investigate the attack and try to identify who was behind it. Unofficially, I can tell you that there are powerful people in Austin who see Mrs. Whitfield's situation as a dangerous precedent. They're not all willing to resort to murder, but they're not necessarily opposed to it either." The implications were chilling. Clara had won in court, had defended her family against armed attack, had proven that justice could triumph over hatred. But somewhere in the territorial capital, men with money and influence were planning her destruction simply because she represented change they couldn't control. "There's something else," Hayes continued, pulling out a telegram from his saddlebag. "This came through this morning, addressed to Mrs. Whitfield. It's from Colorado Territory." Clara's hands trembled as she took the telegram, recognizing the sender's name before she read the message. "Heard about troubles. Stop coming with help. Stop hold on Stop Samuel." The simple words carried more weight than volumes of legal documents. Samuel Washington was coming home, drawn by news of the attack on his children, ready to face whatever dangers awaited him in Texas. "How did he know?" Clara asked. "News travels fast in the territories." Mary Standing Bear explained. "The story of a woman with mixed-race children defeating Jake Whitfield in court has spread from Kansas to California. Samuel probably heard about it weeks ago." Colt studied Clara's face, seeing the complex emotions that the telegram triggered. Joy at the prospect of seeing Samuel again. Fear for his safety if he returned to Texas, and uncertainty about how his presence would affect the life she'd built with Colt. "When?" Colt asked simply. Clara reread the telegram, looking for clues about timing. "It doesn't say, but if he sent this yesterday, and if he's traveling hard, he could be here within the week," Mary finished. "Maybe sooner, if he's riding with others." The prospect of Samuel's return added a new dimension to their situation. Clara's legal victory had been built partly on Thomas's acceptance of her relationship with Samuel, but having Samuel physically present would test the community's tolerance in ways that courtroom testimony couldn't. Marshal Hayes had been listening to this conversation with growing interest. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to ask you about your intentions regarding Mr. Washington. His presence here could complicate the legal situation significantly." "How so?" Clara asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Your ownership of the ranch is legally sound, but it depends partly on the fiction that your children were born within wedlock, even if that marriage was unconventional. If Samuel Washington returns and openly acknowledges paternity, it could provide grounds for new challenges to your inheritance." Colt stepped closer to Clara, his presence a reminder that she didn't face these decisions alone. And if he doesn't acknowledge them, then he's just another ranch hand looking for work, and his presence doesn't change anything legally, Hayes said. But emotionally, socially, that's a different matter. Clara looked down at Rose and Lily, seeing Samuel's features clearly in their faces. These children deserve to know their father, deserve to have him acknowledge them openly, regardless of the legal complications. She'd built her case on the principle that love made a family stronger than blood or law. She wouldn't abandon that principle now. "When Samuel arrives," she said firmly, "he'll be welcomed as the father of my children and a member of this family. If that creates legal problems, we'll face them together." Hayes nodded, seeming to approve of her decision despite its potential complications. "In that case, I'd better stay in the area for a while. If there are going to be new legal challenges, you'll want federal representation present." The next few days passed, in a strange mixture of normalcy and tension. The ranch work continued, cattle needed tending, fences required repair, and the business of managing a large operation didn't pause for personal drama. But everyone was aware that change was coming, that Samuel's arrival would alter the dynamics of their carefully constructed family. Clara found herself thinking often about the silver locket she wore, the one that had stopped Jake's bullet during the courtroom confrontation. Inside were tiny photographs of Rose and Lily, taken by the traveling photographer who'd passed through Dustwater Gulch the previous month. The locket had become a symbol of protection, of love's power to literally shield what mattered most. On the fourth day after the attack, a rider appeared on the horizon, a tall figure on a paint horse, moving with the easy grace of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. Clara saw him first from the ranch house porch, her heart recognizing Samuel Washington before her eyes could make out his features. He was thinner than she remembered, his face weathered by mountain winds and hard work, but his posture was straighter, more confident. The territories had been good to him, had given him the opportunity to stand as an equal among men, rather than bow his head in deference to those who saw his skin color as proof of inferiority. Rose and Lily were playing in the yard, chasing chickens and laughing at their antics. They looked up as the strange rider approached, curious but unafraid. They'd grown up in a house where visitors were usually friendly. Samuel dismounted slowly, his eyes fixed on the children who carried his features but had never heard his voice. Clara could see the emotion he was fighting to control, the overwhelming impact of seeing his daughters healthy and happy after months of uncertainty about their fate. "Rose," Clara called softly. "Lily, come here, sweethearts. There's someone I want you to meet." The girls ran to their mother, Rose reaching her first with Lily close behind. They pressed against Clara's skirts, suddenly shy in the presence of this stranger who seemed to command such attention. "Girls," Clara said, kneeling so she was at their eye level, "this is Samuel. He's your papa, your first papa, who loved you before you were born." Samuel knelt as well, bringing himself down to the children's height. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but thick with emotion. "Hello, Rose. Hello, Lily. You're even more beautiful than I dreamed you'd be." Rose, always the bolder of the twins, stepped forward slightly. "You look like us," she said with the brutal honesty of a child. Samuel smiled, and Clara saw tears gathering in his eyes. "Yes, I do. You have my eyes, and my hands, and I hope you have my love of music too." "Mama plays your guitar," Lily added, warming to the conversation. "She sings us songs you made, does she?" Samuel looked at Clara, understanding passing between them. "I'm glad. Music is one of the most important things I could give you." Colt had been working in the barn when Samuel arrived, but he emerged now, moving with the careful deliberation of a man approaching a situation that could explode in any direction. There was no jealousy in his expression, no territorial aggression, just the quiet assessment of one honorable man meeting another. "Samuel," Colt said, extending his hand, "I'm Colt Braddock. I've been looking after your family." Samuel stood and took the offered hand, measuring the man who'd protected his children when he couldn't. "Mr. Braddock, I heard about what you did, how you stood up to Jake Whitfield and his men. I'm in your debt." "No debt," Colt said simply. "I love them too." The simple statement hung in the air, defining the complex relationship that would govern their lives going forward. Two men, both good, both loving the same woman and the same children, both committed to protecting what they'd helped create. "Marshal Hayes would like to speak with you," Clara told Samuel. "There are legal complications about your being here, about acknowledging the children publicly." Samuel's expression hardened slightly. "I didn't come back to hide who I am or deny my daughters. If there are people who can't accept that these children are mine, that's their problem to solve." Over the following hours, the three adults worked out the practical arrangements of their unusual situation. Samuel would stay on the ranch, working as foreman and acknowledging his role as the children's father. Colt would remain as Clara's husband and the children's adoptive father. Clara would continue as ranch owner and the legal center around which their unconventional family revolved. It should have been awkward, perhaps impossible, but watching the three of them together, seeing how naturally they fell into roles that supported rather than competed with each other, Mary, standing bare, observed that some families were stronger precisely because they were built on choice rather than convention. "Most families have to make do with the relatives they're born with," she said to Doc Henderson as they watched Samuel teach Rose and Lily to play simple chords on his guitar while Colt and Clara discussed ranch business. "This family gets to choose who belongs, and that makes all the difference." The evening meal was a revelation of how well their arrangement could work. Samuel entertained the children with stories of life in the Colorado mountains, while Colt and Clara planned the next day's work. There was no jealousy, no competition, no awkwardness, just the easy rhythm of people who cared about each other and understood their respective roles. But the domestic harmony was threatened by the arrival of another telegram, this one addressed to Marshal Hayes. After reading it, his expression became grave. "There's going to be a formal inquiry," he announced. "Someone in Austin has complained to the territorial governor about the irregular family arrangements here. They're sending an official investigator to determine whether the children are being raised in a morally suitable environment." Clara felt her heart sink. Even after defending her family against legal challenges and armed attack, the forces arrayed against them weren't finished. There would always be another battle, another attempt to destroy what they'd built. "When?" Colt asked. 2 weeks. The investigator will have broad authority to examine the children's living situation, interview witnesses, and make recommendations about their future placement. Samuel's hands stilled on the guitar strings. "Placement? If the investigator determines that the current arrangement is harmful to the children's moral development, he can recommend their removal to more suitable homes," Hayes explained grimly. The threat hung over them like storm clouds, but Clara found herself feeling something she hadn't expected, a kind of calm determination that came from knowing she'd faced worse and survived. "Let them come," she said, echoing her words from the morning after the attack. "We've proven our family works. We've proven we can protect what matters. If they want to challenge that again, we'll show them again why love is stronger than their hatred." That night, as Samuel played lullabies for Rose and Lily, while Colt checked the security around the ranch and Clara cleaned the dinner dishes, their unusual family felt more solid and permanent than any conventional arrangement could have been. They had chosen each other across lines of race and law and social convention. They had defended their choices with their lives, and they would continue to defend them, no matter how many investigators or hired guns or legal challenges the future might bring. Outside, the Texas stars shone down on a ranch where love had taken root in the hardest soil and grown strong enough to weather any storm. 6 months had passed since Samuel's return, and autumn was painting the Texas landscape in the same golden hues that had marked Clara's first meeting with Colt over a year ago. The territorial investigator had come and gone, his official report concluding that Rose and Lily Whitfield were thriving in a stable. loving environment that promotes their moral and intellectual development. The victory had been decisive, but more importantly, it had been final. The ranch prospered under the management of 3 adults who understood that their strength lay in cooperation rather than competition. Samuel's expertise with horses had expanded their breeding program. Colt's knowledge of cattle had improved their herds, and Clara's business acumen had opened new markets that didn't care about the color of their partner's skin or the unconventional nature of their family. On this particular morning, Clara stood in the ranch cemetery, looking down at a new granite headstone that read simply, "Samuel Washington, beloved father and friend. His music lives on." The marker stood in the same plot where Thomas Whitfield had been buried, their shared headstone reading, "Together in love, together in rest." But Samuel Washington wasn't dead. He was very much alive, working with Colt to move cattle to the new railroad depot 20 miles south. The headstone was Clara's way of giving him the recognition and respect he deserved, ensuring that future generations would know he'd been part of this family, part of this land, part of the story that had transformed Dustwater Gulch from a place ruled by hatred into something approaching civilization. "Mama, why does Papa Samuel have a stone if he's not sleeping under it?" Rose asked, tugging at Clara's skirt. At 3 years old, she was endlessly curious about the world around her, asking questions that often revealed the innocent wisdom children possessed. "Because sometimes," Clara explained, kneeling beside her daughter, "we need to make sure important people are remembered, even when they're still with us. Papa Samuel's stone tells everyone who passes by that he belonged here, that he was loved here, that his life mattered." Lily, always more thoughtful than her sister, studied the headstone with serious concentration. "Will we have stones too?" "Someday, sweetheart, but not for a very long time. We have too much living to do first." The children had grown into beautiful, confident little girls who moved through the world with the security of children who'd never doubted their worth. They spoke English and Spanish with equal fluency, having learned from the Mexican families who worked the ranch. They could ride horses almost before they could walk properly, having been taught by both Colt and Samuel. And they could play simple melodies on their father's guitar, their small fingers already showing promise of inheriting his musical gifts. Most importantly, they'd grown up in a community that had learned to judge people by their actions rather than their ancestry. Dustwater Gulch had changed in fundamental ways since Clara's legal victory and the defeat of Jake Whitfield's forces. The new sheriff, appointed by territorial authorities, enforced laws without regard to race or social position. Preacher Williams had begun delivering sermons about Christian charity that specifically addressed the treatment of mixed families. Even the school had opened its doors to all children, regardless of their parentage. "Mrs. Whitfield?" a voice called from the ranch house. Clara turned to see Mary standing bare, approaching with a letter in her weathered hands. "This came on today's stage. Looks official." Clara accepted the envelope. With some trepidation, official letters had brought too much trouble in the past. But this one bore the seal of the territorial governor, and when she opened it, she found something unexpected, an invitation rather than a threat. "What is it?" Rose asked, trying to read over her mother's shoulder. "It's an invitation to Austin," Clara said slowly, still absorbing the contents. "The territorial government wants me to speak to a committee about family law reform. They're considering legislation that would protect unconventional families from legal challenges." The irony was profound. The same authorities who'd once threatened to take her children now wanted her expertise on protecting families like hers. Clara Whitfield had become more than a successful ranch owner. She'd become a symbol of change, proof that love could triumph over hatred if people were willing to fight for it. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in the ranch house dining room, Clara shared the news about the invitation. The room had been expanded since Samuel's return, with a long table that could accommodate their extended family. Colt and Samuel. The children, Mary standing bare, and often Doc Henderson or other friends who'd become part of their chosen clan. "You should go," Samuel said after reading the letter. "What you've accomplished here, what we've all accomplished, it could help other families facing the same challenges." Colt nodded agreement. "The ranch can manage without you for a few weeks. And it's important that people in Austin understand that families like ours aren't threats to society. We're proof that society can be better than its worst impulses." Clara looked around the table at the faces of people she loved, people who'd chosen to stand with her when standing alone would have been easier. They'd built something beautiful and strong and lasting, but more importantly, they'd proven it could be done. "I'll go," she decided, "but I want to bring something with me." She disappeared into the house and returned with Samuel's guitar, the honey-colored wood gleaming in the lamplight. "If I'm going to tell our story, I want them to hear the music that made it possible. They need to understand that some families are held together by more than law or blood. They're held together by the songs that carry love from one generation to the next." Over the following weeks, as Clara prepared for her journey to Austin, the ranch continued to thrive. The cattle drive to the railroad had been successful, earning them enough profit to expand their operations and improve the workers' housing. Samuel had started a small school for the Mexican children, teaching them to read and write in both languages. Colt had begun training Rose and Lily in marksmanship, believing that strong women should know how to protect themselves. The night before Clara's departure, the family gathered on the porch for one final evening together. Samuel played his guitar while the children sang along, their voices blending in harmonies that spoke of joy and security and belonging. Colt sat nearby, cleaning his father's compass, the instrument that had guided him through the darkest moments of their struggle. "Whatever they ask you in Austin," Colt said as the music wound down, "just tell them the truth. Tell them that love makes families stronger than fear ever could. Tell them that children raised with respect and security grow up to be the kind of people who make the world better." Clara looked out over the ranch that had become their sanctuary, their fortress, their home. In the distance, she could see the lights from the workers' quarters, where families lived in peace and prosperity. Closer to the house, the cemetery held the markers of those who'd come before Thomas, who'd given her legal protection. Samuel's symbolic stone, which honored love that transcended death. And someday, markers for all of them, testament to lives lived with courage and purpose. "I'll tell them that some victories are worth whatever they cost," she said finally, "and that some families are strong enough to change the world, one child at a time." The next morning, Clara set out for Austin carrying Samuel's guitar and a heart full of stories about love, triumphing over hatred, about families choosing each other across every line society could draw, about children who would grow up free because their parents had been willing to fight for freedom. Behind her, the ranch continued its work. Cattle grazed in fields watered by honest sweat. Children learned lessons that would make them better adults, and three people who'd found each other against impossible odds continued proving that some kinds of love were strong enough to last forever. The sun rose over the Texas plains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and promise, illuminating a future where Rose and Lily would grow up knowing they belonged, knowing they mattered, knowing their parents had built something beautiful and lasting from the raw materials of courage and hope and an unshakable faith that tomorrow could be better than today. In the distance, a mockingbird sang from a fence post, its voice carrying across the prairie like a prayer of gratitude for the simple miracle of family, the enduring power of love, and the endless possibility that existed whenever good people chose to stand together against the darkness.